Jammer Audio, a division of JMR Press, is pleased to present The Old Man's Trousers by Josh Rogan, narrated by Jan Elaine Gray. Chapter 1. An Accident. Ken Rowley was a great, big, huge, giant man. He was so giant that he only just managed to fit behind the wheel of his delivery van, and this was only because the adjustable driver's seat was pushed back as far as it would go. Ken worked as a driver for a laundry cleaning and delivery service. He was known to most people as Roly-Poly, but what most people did not know was that he did not like this nickname. But Ken was such a nice man that he never liked causing any upset or being any bother to anyone at all. He parked his van outside the gates of a large detached house, number 41 Willow Crescent, or Sunnyglade. This was in Forbes Mallet, a little village in the county of Wiltshire. Ken and his family also lived in Forbes Mallet, but not on this side of the tracks. The family who lived there, the St. Johns, were rather posh, as were most of the families in Willow Crescent. Ken did not mind this as such, and was probably the reason why he was so round. "Come in, have a slice of gâteau, Ken. Oh, before you go, here's some biscuits." And, "How are the family, Ken?" "Good, good. Well, here's a little something for you all." This could be anything from chocolate biscuits to a bottle of whiskey with a 20-pound note wrapped around it. Such was the generosity of the posh but kind folks of Willow Crescent, apart from the St. John family. To them, noblesse oblige was a mental illness. Ken opened the back of his van, took out the basket of clean laundry, and huffed and puffed up the path to the front door. If it was Monday or Wednesday, then it would not have bothered him so much, but it was Tuesday. Rose, the housekeeper and carer, was off every Tuesday, and because of this Ken had dreaded this day and all of his 11 years delivering to the St. Johns. This was because the master of the house was at home on Tuesdays and always answered the door. This had come about because the man's father, an elderly, frail widower, needed constant care and attention, and so his son had to take every Tuesday off in Rose's absence. The bald but heavily mustachioed Graham Kitchener St. John stood there, smiling, one hand holding on to his pipe, which he puffed merrily away on, and the other in the pocket of his brown Aran cardigan. "Ah, Tuesday again, R.P., Tuesday again." He said this every Tuesday. "Yep, Tuesday again," replied R.P. with a forced smile. He said this every Tuesday. He hated that nickname even more than the full Roly-Poly. No one else called him R.P., not his family, friends, or neighbors. But Graham Kitchener St. John did not call him anything else. Ken wished he had the backbone to tell him not to call him that any more, but he just couldn't take the tension of confrontation. Even K.R. would be acceptable, a compromise, but he just could not bring himself to say anything. So, for 11 years, R.P. it was, to Mr. St. John, anyway. Mr. St. John took the basket off Ken, and Ken went to walk away. Normally, there was nothing to go back to the laundry on Tuesdays, but today was an exception. "Oh, hang on, R.P. There's a few things to go. Pops was a bit sloppy at the regimental dinner last night." Ken knew all about Pops, one Harris Kitchener St. John, Colonel retired, Wiltshire Rifles. He was even worse than his son. He called Ken the Dobie Walla to the rest of the family, to Rose, and even to Ken's face. The only good thing, for Ken anyway, was that as the years had gone by, infirmity, brought on by too rich a diet, too many cigars, and too much port meant that Ken rarely saw the old firebrand. Ken stood there impatiently while Mr. St. John the Younger went off to fetch the full laundry basket, including a pair of port and gravy-stained, red-striped ceremonial army trousers, or DJs, belonging to the old man. "Thanks, bye now," said Ken, with as much false friendliness as he could muster. He was careful not to let his face show how he felt. One time he was that fed up, he simply walked off without saying a word, but on returning to the depot found an irate Mr. Hollings, depot manager, West Division, Kleenex Corporation, waiting to tear a strip off Ken for, quote, being surly, and threatened him with a sack if it ever happened again. "Bye, R.P. Oh, what is it tonight, then? 3 family-sized pies and a swift 20 down the Volan-Hamster?" Yeah, something like that. Mustache!" Ken walked back down the path, opened the back of his van, and lifted the basket containing the old man's badly stained trousers into it. The problem here was that it had been a busy day, and the van was nearly at bursting point, and so the basket from the St. John residence was wedged against the inside of the rear door. Ken drove off, whistling and singing to himself as he drove along the main road and back towards the Russellboro department of the Kleenex Corporation. "And now the end is near, and so I face the final flip and Jiminy." A huge Irish wolfhound ran out into the road. This was followed by the sound of squealing tires, and not just from Ken's van. To avoid running the dog over, the driver of another delivery van swerved to the right and over towards Ken, which meant Ken had no option but to swerve further over to the left and into what seemed to be an army jeep. But it was all in vain. Despite a frantic screeching of 3 sets of brakes, within seconds all 3 vehicles had smashed into each other. The driver of the jeep was flung out and into a hedge. Ken banged his head on the dashboard, and the driver of the other van banged his head on the window screen, which then shattered. But, thankfully, none of the 3 were seriously hurt. Not long after, courtesy of an emergency call made by a passing cyclist who had only just missed the collision herself, the police and the ambulance service arrived to survey the scene. Despite a quick check by the paramedics, revealing just a few aches, bruising, and minor lesions, the 3 men were still asked to go to hospital for a checkup, just in case. This request was rather unwisely refused by all of them. As for the vehicles, it turned out that, despite some bad dents and broken glass, the 2 vans could still be driven. But not the Jeep. That was stuck in a ditch. Ironically, the trouble that Ken found himself in the very next day, and would soon involve a great many more people, may not have come about at all if it were not for the diligence and efficiency of the police when executing their duty. It was while the 2 policemen explained that they had to take statements that the very thing that would cause so much trouble began to take shape, shielded from the sight of Ken and the others. A split second after the accident, there were clothes, which were bound for the laundry, strewn all over the road. This was because the back door of the van had been wrenched right off, with all the baskets flying out, losing their lids, and, worse still, their loads. The side door of the other van was not so much damaged as forcefully opened upon impact, and, with the almighty jolt, 5 large plastic crates were jettisoned out onto the road. 4 of the crates remained intact, but not the 5th. The plastic lid of this one had flown off high into the sky, over a farmer's field, smacked right into the rump of a prized bull, which then stampeded across the field, and gave good cause for the farm workers to finish early that day. The contents of this crate, a selection of different books, were flung all over the place. The back end of the army jeep was jutting out from the ditch, suspended in the air by more than a meter. It was the larger, open-back type, but its tailgate had been forced down with a collision, and a large tarpaulin sheet had torn away from its fastenings, revealing the jeep's cargo. In the back was a strange-looking machine, odd in shape, with levers, buttons, and dials all over it. On top of this were now a pile of clothes, including old St. John's DJs, and 3 books from the other delivery van. At that moment, the machine was emitting a low humming sound and was giving off a dull green light. This went on for several minutes. The police completed the preliminaries and then cordoned off the road, while Ken and the other driver collected what they could of their clothes and books. As for the driver of the jeep, an army corporal, he radioed the local army base and requested that a towing vehicle be sent to haul the jeep out of the ditch. As there was nothing else he could do, and as it was getting close to chow time in the mess, he quickly walked off back to camp. "Old Hollings'll have me for this, he really will. He'll blame me, not that goofy dog," muttered Ken to himself, as he did the best he could, not only to gather up all the laundry, but to work out which item belonged to which basket. As for Huxtable, the Irish wolfhound, he was now enjoying a huge bowl of chicken curry, left over by his owner, old Hyacinth Witherspoon, Forbes Mallet's resident batty old grump, and, of course, Irish wolfhound lover. Ken continued to mutter to himself, and occasionally crisscrossed with the equally carfuffle driver for Wendell's Books of Swindon. They both traded a sigh and a sickly smile, and went back to their frustrating reclamation of their respective loads. Neither Ken nor the other driver saw a pair of red-striped, ceremonial regimental army trousers scramble out of the jeep and run away down the road. Chapter 2. Smarty Pants. Ken arrived back at the depot and was immediately summoned to the office of Mr. Hollings, depot manager, West Division. He was a small, sour-faced man with an unkempt crop of greasy, gray hair. "I'm warning you, Rolly," Hollings said. "This will cost you your job." But Mr. Hollings, it wasn't my fault. There was this wacky great dog and he ran out." "Don't give me that. You were probably eating a huge jam pie, or counting your tips. I'm putting a stop to that, just you wait and see. I've served this company for 30 years, but no one's ever given me yesterday's custard, never mind tips. Right, now I suggest—" "Yes, what is it?" Maxine Yeo, the MD's secretary, stood there, with a look of fury on her face. Although she was tall, pretty, and slim with long, shiny black hair, she was also fiery-tempered when spoken down to or yelled at. No one, not old Hollings or any other manager, got away with speaking to her in such a manner. The thing is, Hollings knew this. "Oh, it's you, Maxine, sorry. What can I do for you?" he said in a sickly manner, with an equally sickly smile on his face, but Maxine was having none of it. "Mr. Kelly wants to see you in his office, now." "Oh, hello, roly-poly. Family all right?" "Fine, thanks, Maxie, fine. And you?" "Well, I was. Anyway, give my love to Rita. Tell her I'll see her at the bingo." "Surely, Maxie, surely. Bye." With that, Maxine stormed off and slammed the door and ran back up the stairs to her office, next to the office of Jeremy Kelly, Jr., M.D. of Kleenex. Ken liked Maxine, but she still called him Roly-Poly.
You! Stay here. I haven't finished with you yet.
Mr. Thomas Hollings, Depot Manager, West Division, then went off to see the boss, the big boss. Jeremy Kelly was a good man. He knew how difficult a time of it his workers had under Mr. Hollings, and he had often intervened in rows, overturned planned disciplinary procedures, and he had even enjoyed the occasional pint with Ken, and, to Ken's delight, called him Ken. The fact that Jeremy Kelly was even larger than Ken, and had endured the nickname of Kelly the Belly for many years, may have had something to do with this. The meeting between Mr. Kelly and Mr. Hollings lasted just over half an hour. It turned out that Ken had not been able to put all of the right laundry back in the right baskets, and of course, there was no sign of old St. John's red-striped army trousers. Jeremy Kelly was worried, but he did not blame Ken. But Hollings most certainly did, but not to his boss, who stopped his musing and decided on a course of action. Look, Tom, okay, we need to sort this out, but it was an accident, just one of those things. You should be grateful, as I am, that it wasn't worse than it easily could have been. Now, please ask Ken, politely mind, if he would mind checking around the road where the accident was. Check the hedges and the field, even call in on Old Man Packer's place. Will you do that?
Yes, of course, Mr. Kelly, of course. I don't know what made you think I blamed Ken. Of course I don't. Leave it with me. I'll sort it all out.
Good man, Tom, good man. As for the rest, well, I'll personally apologize to those whose laundry got mixed up, said the often naive Jeremy Kelly. Well, we'd best get to it then, both of us. A few moments later, Mr. Hollings was back in his own office and looking out of the window, watching Jeremy Kelly drive off to make his personal apologies to several angry customers, which included the St. John's, whom were very angry. Mr. Hollings turned with venom in his eyes towards an awkward-looking Ken, once again summoned to his superior's office.
You've done it this time. Kelly the Belly is furious, absolutely doing his nut. He says if you don't find those flipping trousers, you're out on your ear and your rear. Now get out and find them, now.
A very worried Ken Rowley left Mr. Hollings' office and got back in his van. This was still showing signs of the collision, although the back doors had been hastily and poorly welded back on. Ken fired up the engine and drove off towards Forbes Mallet. As he approached the section of the road where the crash had been, he was surprised to find that the other van driver, as well as the Army corporal, were by the roadside, talking to each other. Ken pulled up in front of the jeep, which was now back on the road again. He got out and went over to the two men. "Hello there! Didn't expect to see you back here," said Ken. "Got to, mate, got to," said the other van driver. "Same here," added the corporal. An awkward silence ensued, and eventually Ken decided to crack on. "Well, must get to it." He forlornly started looking down, hoping the errant trousers would suddenly appear, relatively undamaged, either in the gutter or on the grass verge, but of course they did not. While the two other men looked on with quizzical looks on their faces, Ken now moved over to the hedging and began looking in between the bushes, kicking reeds to one side, and even occasionally peering through into Farmer Packer's field. It was useless. What was worse, it began to rain. He had no intention of carrying on the search, as the skies duly opened and the rain lashed down. He then realized something, The corporal's jeep was of the open type, and the other man's van had still not had its windows replaced. "Here, you two! You can get in me van if you want to!" The two needed no further prompting, and ran across to join Ken. Soon all three were out of the rain and sat, 3 in a row, in the front. But still silence ensued. Ken decided to break the ice. "So, you've not lost stuff as well, have you?" Straight away the van driver admitted that he had, while the corporal said, sort of, and looked more than a little awkward. "Well, you ain't going to believe this, but I could get the sack if I don't find a pair of flippin' army dress trousers. You know, well, you'll know anyway." Ken looked directly at the corporal when he said this. "Those kecks with the red stripes down the side." The corporal nodded. "DJs. It really means dinner jacket, but it applies to the trousers as well." "So, one of our mob has lost his kecks, eh?" he asked with a smile. "Well, not exactly. They belong to one of them fellas who gets a 3-year commission counting tins of bully beef, and still call themselves by their old rank 57 years later. Bit of a fraud is old Harris." In this, Ken was not really right. Old man St. John had fought in the Second World War, was injured 3 times, and signed himself out of hospital on each occasion, as he couldn't bear not to be at the front line leading his men. He was not a nice man, as Ken well knew, but to be fair, he was an excellent leader. Hundreds of men lived on through the war and afterwards, and perhaps would not have done it if it were not for the bravery and intelligence of their then captain. "Ah, you mean old man St. John, don't you?" said the knowing corporal. "Well, it all makes sense. It's legend throughout the whole camp that he kept his best suit from his army days, his prized DJs. He wore them at the liberation of Paris in 1944. Blimey, mate, in his eyes you've done something worse than murder. If he doesn't get you the sack, his son will." "Don't I know it?" said an even more forlorn Ken, now visualizing a final meeting with Hollings, Jeremy Kelly, and an irate terrible twosome, the St. John's Senior and Junior. In order to take his mind off things, Ken decided to ask the other two what they hoped to find. He saw the corporal shift uneasily in his seat as he asked this. The other van driver also hesitated, but only for a moment, and then he relaxed. "Well," the van driver said, "I don't suppose there is any real harm in telling you this. As well as novels, kids' books, and such, we supply one-off print runs of things, especially to the army. You'll know about this, Corp, I'll bet. Anyway, there's going to be an exercise around this area soon, and I was supplying the top brass at the army camp with their copies of the outlines of the exercise and the plans of the enemy and such like. Not a real enemy, of course, just another regiment. Blimey, the things I read during a wet lunchtime. Well, anyway, the thing is, there's nothing in the print to show it's just an exercise, so some poor old codger might be getting his old tin helmet out, thinking we're at war again. Because of all this, your lot, Corp, have been on to our lot, and the things they've threatened me with. Anyway, I found most of the books yesterday, but there's 3 that are still missing, but I can't think what's happened to the rest." "Well, I'll be!" "What is it?" asked Ken and the corporal, upon seeing the other man's now very terrified and very white face. He could only point at the windscreen, and there, in front of the van, was old man St. John's red-striped army trousers. Although there were no legs in them, human legs that is, and there certainly wasn't a body, the trousers moved in such a way as if there were, but invisible to all others. The trousers gave a little at the knee, as if an invisible head was bending down and peering closer at the 3 terrified men in the van. Then yet again the red-striped trousers ran off, but not down the road, but in through the hedge and across the farmer's field. "I don't believe this!" yelled Ken, who thought the stress of the situation was telling on him. "But we all saw it," spluttered the van driver. "We can't all have gone nuts." "Hey!" protested Ken. "Oh, we're sorry," said the van driver, "but you know what I mean." "No, I don't," spluttered the still aggrieved Ken. "No, we all saw it. I was half expecting this," cut in the corporal. "You what?" shouted the other two at the same time. "Well, you can bet your life the whole county will know by tea time, and the whole world by tomorrow. So you may as well know the truth." "Which is?" demanded Ken. "I'm from a brand new Army regiment, the NER, which stands for the Nuclear Espionage Regiment." "And what's all that in aid of?" demanded the van driver. "Look, is there anywhere we can go to talk? We're only a mile or so from the base, and I don't want the top brass to know I've been talking to you two, or anyone else for that matter." "My house," said Ken. "I need a cup of char." "Never mind tea. Have you got any whiskey?" asked the van driver. "That we have," replied Ken. "My house it is, then," and gave a grim smile as he drove off down the road, and silence once again ensued. Chapter 3. Bilbo Gilbo. Half an hour later, all three men were sitting in Ken's lounge, drinking tea with whiskey in it, minus the tea. They had introduced themselves to each other. The corporal's name was Jack Anderson. The van driver's name was Joel Warrington. Corporal Jack Anderson was keen to crack on. "I'll make this as quick as I can," he said, "because I'll have to report in soon. Boffins based on our camp, but who are really secondies from Starboard Heights, a top-secret establishment not far from here, have developed something called Synthetic Nuclear Intelligence Personality, or SNP, a bit like robots, but far more ingenious. Using the right input of memory and information, as well as personality traits, they have had amazing success with implanting this synthetic intelligence into things you would not think was possible. Anyway, the military, who had been pressured into financing the project, did not believe the Boffins, but a month later they had to back down and concede they were wrong and that the Boffins were right. You know that exercise you mentioned?" Joel nodded. "Well, this is the second one. The first was to prove to the top brass it worked. The second was to show the top bodgers in NATO. But back to the first. The Boffins said that they would know what the top brass were planning shortly after they had planned it. Here's the best bit. Within 30 minutes of the plans for the exercise being rubber-stamped, the Boffins contacted the top brass and told them word for word what the top brass had planned. After frantically searching for bugs, and after the interrogation of each of those involved by independent interrogators to see if they were acting as spies came to nothing, top brass conceded defeat. They didn't know how the Boffins had done it. Here's how. Their laundry. Ken, you've lost a little business lately, haven't you?" Ken nodded and went to say something, but Jack gestured for him to remain quiet and patient. "Snip's Laundry? New firm? Yes? Well, that's us. It was our way in. Our spies were none other than a shirt and a pair of trousers. They never suspected a thing." "Well, I'll be unbelievable," said Ken, while Joel just scratched his head. "The trouble is," continued Jack, "it's got even more complicated than anyone expected it to be. My guess is the SNP implanter, a machine I was taking back to base, activated after the crash. Obviously, it's caused the old man's trousers to be implanted. But with what? The input program is held on the SNP mainframe back at camp. But here's my guess. I think it's been implanted with information from the books you say you've lost, Joel. The missing books? But how? Because here are your missing books. They were in the back of the Jeep. Jack handed Joel 3 books. They were Operation SNP, Overview, HMSO, Top Secret. Happy Harold and His Chums, by Ingrid Burton. From Land's End to John O'Groats, by Mitch Lassiter. After a few moments of stunned silence, Ken finally spoke up. Well, stick a pin in me and call me Twiggy. Not only am I in dead lumber for losing the old man's trousers, they've upped and left with a synthetic personality. What on earth is going to happen next? Joel couldn't even begin to think what was going to happen next, so did not reply. But Jack sighed and gave his view of the situation. I know it sounds crazy, but I think the trousers will act out a combination of the contents of all 3 books. The only thing to be done is for all 3 of us to meet up again, and quite soon, to go through each of the books and see if we can make some sense of all of this. But for now, I've got to go. Well, Ken thought, the wife's off to Brighton tomorrow to see her sister, and the lad is away at university. We can all meet again here, if you like. This was readily agreed to, and both Ken's visitors said their goodbyes and began the long walk in the rain back to where their vehicles were parked, and wondered why Ken had not offered to do the honors. But Ken's mind was elsewhere. After closing the front door, the phone rang. "Hello?" said Ken. It was Hollings. "No, Mr. Hollings, no luck at all. Sorry." "You're going to be more than sorry," Hollings said. "You're fired. Return the van, collect your things, and then don't come back again." "Yes, Mr. Hollings, I will." Ken was crying. He needed his job, and he wondered just how he was going to tell his wife, who couldn't work herself due to severe rheumatics, that he had been fired from the only job he had ever been good at, and enjoyed, most of the time. He sat in the front lounge for some time and mused on his current misfortune, and it was only the front door opening which dragged him back to the here and now. Ken went into the hall to greet his wife, who had struggled home with the shopping. "Hello, Rita, love. Here, give me those. Sit yourself down. I'll put the kettle on." Doing his best to stifle his tears, he put the shopping away while his wife sat down in the lounge. "Funny thing happened just now, Ken." Or what was it?" "An army chap was belting along the road in his jeep when he was forced off the main road and down a country lane by 4 MPs in a jeep." "Military policemen!" exclaimed Ken. "Jack's had it." "Jack, dear?" Ken stopped stirring the teacups and looked directly at the teaspoon. I was looking for my favorite teaspoon, but then I realized. Jack, next door, he's had it." "Jack borrowed a teaspoon? I knew they were hard up, but it must be worse than I thought." "Suppose so," muttered Ken, while throwing his favorite teaspoon out the kitchen window. "I'll have to call round later," Rita said. "There's some spare lamb and bath salts." "Oh, no. He telephoned before. They were quarantined," spluttered a desperate Ken. "Quarantined? How? Why?" "Well, you know their Ernie?" "Yes." Well, he's been knocking about with a lad from the School of Tropical Medicine in Liverpool. What? That funny city where they are all gangsters and everyone lives in cardboard boxes? No, silly, that's London. Oh, yes, that's right. Well, a highly poisonous spider escaped and bit this lad. And without him realizing it, he caught, Bilbo Gilbo, a highly contagious tropical disease. Trouble was, before anyone realized he was ill, he borrowed Ernie's trainers for a day or so, gave 'em back, passed the disease on to him, and now the whole family have got it. Bilbo Gilbo? Oh dear! I don't wish to sound callous, but we'll have to move. I'll call the estate agents. Oh, there's no need for that. You can only catch it if you are within 3 feet of them, and even then you mightn't get it, but you can't share any of their stuff. But you said it was highly contagious. Well, sometimes. Depends on how hungry the spider is when it bites. Oh. Well, I'll save the lamb for when they are better, replied Rita, who moved from the chair nearest to the partition wall and sat on the settee in the bay window. Chapter 4. Happy Harold and the Brain. After a near sleepless night for Ken, and a totally sleepless night for his wife, who had visions of a return of the Black Death to the whole village of Forbes Mallet, morning finally arrived. After much yawning and hustle and bustle, while the luggage was checked and double-checked, Ken waved goodbye to his wife as a taxi drove away to the railway station for her trip to Brighton. Ken explained he had especially taken the day off to help with the luggage, but then feigned a strained back as the departure time loomed nearer. An hour later, Ken explained to Joel that Jack most probably would not make it. He was right. He didn't. Now, where do we start? Asked Ken. Well, my old Nan used to say, if you don't know where to start, it doesn't matter. Oh, well, that's it then, humped Ken. No, she meant, as it doesn't matter, you start anywhere. Oh, said a foolish-sounding Ken. Look, Joel said. Here's the books. Let's have a look through them. Hopefully, we may be able to think the way these mysterious red-striped trousers are thinking. While Joel looked through the book outlining the army exercise, Ken got stuck into Happy Harold and His Chums, and laughed out loud every 3 minutes. After an hour or so, Joel closed his book. Anything? He asked of Ken. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Our Jeff should read these, never mind going all boggly on his PlayStation. You see, in the 3rd chapter, Harold and his chums go fishing on the riverbank at the same time as a marine towing cable breaks away from a tugboat. Within seconds, huge loops of cable were wrapped around a sluice wheel at the dock, while the slack attached itself to a canal barge as it turned off from the estuary and chugged inland along the River Odwick. Just then, Harold snagged his line on something. Anyway, his mates all help, and they pull, and they pull, and they pull, thinking they were landing a whopper, not knowing they had dislodged a huge cable from a barge. It only turned out that the cable was also attached to the Queen Mary, which the tugboat was supposed to tow out into the open sea. With each tug of their fishing lines, the wheel turned, and Harold and his chums began to drag the Queen Mary along the River Odwick. Brilliant! Absolute... No, not really. You? Asked Ken. realizing that Joel was looking directly at him and he wasn't smiling. "Possibly," replied an annoyed Joel. The exercise was to prevent the enemy from stealing the entire food supply for the area and starving everyone into surrendering. That's the main gist of it. The rest just tells the defenders to be aware. It's not as detailed as I thought it would be, but I think I know why that is. The top brass are probably scared of being made to look like fools again, so have kept all written information to a minimum. And after all, if the enemy have been given free rein, as they would in a real war, then logically no one would know for certain, would they? It would just be guesswork. You know, you've got something there, but it still doesn't help us find the missing trousers. And I've just had another thought," said Ken. "How on earth can a pair of trousers pass on information? Okay, it's been implanted by mistake, but there's still no head or mouth." "Good point. It's a pity Jack isn't here. He might have known the answer to that one," replied Joel. Next moment there was a loud knock on the door. Ken opened up. It was Corporal Jack Anderson. "Quick, let me in. I've escaped." But, was all Ken managed to say in reply. Jack ran past Ken, into the kitchen, and gulped down mouthfuls of water from Ken's pint mug. And then he burped. Ken had followed him into the kitchen and just stood there dumbfounded. Jack said nothing more, walked past Ken, and went into the lounge and sat down. "What's up with you?" asked a surprised Joel. Then Ken came in, scratched his bonds, and he too sat down. With his thirst finally slaked, Jack hurriedly explained what had happened. "They've threatened me with 10 years in the glass house for blabbing, so I jumped from a third-story window and ran all the way here. I was quite away from here yesterday, so they shouldn't be able to connect you two to me yet," said Jack, and rather ominously at that. "But how do they know you blabbed?" asked an exasperated Ken. "We were seen," Jack said. "Now, don't worry. I could tell that whoever snitched on me, us, couldn't see very much. In fact, the way I was interrogated, they don't even know how many were involved in the accident." "Well, how can you tell that?" asked an uncertain Joel. "Oh, I know their tricks, mate. Been in bother a few times with me, though nothing as serious as this. They think the accident was staged, so I could let our enemies see the snip machine, even sell it to them. They first of all asked me to name all 5 accomplices, then to tell them who were the 4 mystery men. Then it was 2 women and even a kid. But when they asked about the 7 suited gorillas in shades, I knew they were fishing. One good thing, this is so secret they won't even ask the local police what they know, in case some stupid plod gets gassed down the local and blurts it out. Well, that's something at least. I can hide you today, but I don't know about tomorrow," said Ken, more than a little worried. "Don't worry about that. By tomorrow I'll be far away from here." "So you're not going to help us find these trousers?" yelled Ken. No," replied Jack, rather sheepishly. "Now listen here, matey. It looks like I've lost my job because of your mob's stupid machine. You owe it to me, and Joel, to stay and help." "He's right, you know," added Joel. "My bosses aren't 3 happy either. You should stay." Jack looked at Ken, to Joel, and back to Ken again. He knew they were right. "Well, okay then, but we'll have to act fast. The sooner we recover the trousers, then maybe none of us will suffer." "I think they will all be jolly well grateful we got them back," spluttered Ken, but not entirely convinced that Hollings would see things that way. Yeah, maybe," replied an equally uncertain Jack. "Right. We were just talking about how can a pair of trousers actually pass information on. They've got no head, said Ken. Easy, replied Jack. They use the brain. The brain, retorted Ken and Joel at the same time. Yes, it's a retrieval program for using on implanted objects. BRAIN. This stands for Bioretrieval Artificial Intelligence Network. It converts everything the object, in this case the trousers, have experienced and heard, and then relays the information on to its operators. It's a head-shaped computer placed above a chair, surrounded by sensors. The object gets placed in the chair, the brain is activated, and soon after, what the object knows, its masters know. Simple, really. Ingenious. But I've just had a thought. If we capture the trousers, then surely it's all over anyway, and we wouldn't need the brain, suggested Joel. If only, mate, if only, replied Jack. Within an hour of handing them back to the St. John's, they'd be on the blower to us, screaming for help as the trousers run amok right around their house. They need to be deactivated, or we're in dead lumber. Hang on, suddenly interjected Ken. Okay, there's the brain, but that's not part of the object, is it? How on earth can a pair of trousers do anything? It's only a pair of cloth legs. You've not got this after all, neither of you, said Jack. The implanted intelligence is something far greater than its host. Another aspect of this invention is that it gives inanimate objects the same powers and abilities as you and I, if it's an attempt to copy humans, that is. It's something the Boffins call extended flexible molecularization, or EFM for short. When necessary, those trousers can extend themselves to full body form, for short periods anyway. You can bet your life that those trousers can think and do things that you just would not think they could do. It's just like having the invisible man. Except there ain't no man, invisible or otherwise. I just don't get this, said a confused Ken. Nor me, added Joel. Look, you don't have to get it, replied Jack. Just accept it. In fact, just think of the trousers as being clawed reins in the Invisible Man films. That will help you accept what we are up against. Anyway, have you got anything more from those books? Ken burst out laughing. Again. Superb! You see, Ripper Bullstock, Happy Harold's bitter enemy, thought he'd got the better of Harold and his chums. But what Ripper didn't know, that it was the vicar who was actually on the toilet and, Sorry, no, not really. I wouldn't say that, Ken, said Jack. No, replied a surprised Ken. I think the trousers will use the tricks played by Happy Harold and his pals, or his enemies, try to achieve the objectives as set out in the exercise plans, and then he'll think of the travel book as his getaway plans, maps, trains, buses, and so on. Yes, yelled Joel. Yes, added an uncertain Ken. The three men then spent the next 5 hours working out the possibilities of how the pair of red-striped trousers would bring the area to its knees by using the tricks and jolly japes as written in Happy Harold and his chums. Chapter 5. Reading Up. Ken, Jack, and Joel read on in comparative silence. It was only comparative silence because Ken chuckled involuntarily every few minutes. Through continually cross-referencing all 3 books, the 3 men were able to narrow the possibilities down to just one course of action and in the one area, although exactly what that course of action would be sadly still eluded them. In the Happy Harold book there was a village. There was only one village in the immediate area, Forbes Mallet. The only sources of food in the village where Happy Harold lived were Farmer Glum's farm, a small cottage sweet shop and general store, and a dairy. There was only one farm in Forbes Mallet, Packer's Farm, and just one shop which sold foodstuffs and sweets, although there were a handful of other types of shops. There was only one small railway station near to where Happy Harold lived, Plumley Station. There was only one station in the area, Forbes Mallet Railway Station. The three men, now friends, were satisfied that if the old man's trousers were to make an escape bid, it would be from here. But if they got away, then, seeing as the travel book was Land's End to John O'Groats, then there would be no immediate clue as to whether the trousers would travel north or south. As time went by, Jack became more jittery by the minute. He was certain that the MPs would catch up with him soon. After much deliberation, Ken finally relented and agreed to let Jack stay. Ken also phoned his wife in her sister's house in Brighton. "Yes, dear, that's right. The whole village has been cordoned off. We're surrounded by the SAS. If we leave, we'll be shot." "Yes, I'm all right, but apparently the authorities are not taking any chances. So until the antidotes arrive, no one enters or leaves." "Yes, dear, that's what they said. A month or so, at the least." "Yes. Love you too. Love to Josie and the kids. Bye." As there was nothing further they could do that day, and as Joel had to go home, the meeting broke up. After Joel had driven off, and with Jack sitting on the sofa, shaking like a leaf and frequently glancing out of the window, Ken opened the freezer, took out a packet of frozen pies, thought for a moment, put it back, and drove to Russellborough for fish and chips. No sooner had this been wolfed down by both Ken and Jack than who should come walking up Ken's path but a very shamefaced Mr. Hollins and a very sad-looking Jeremy Kelly, M.D. Hello," said a mystified Ken as he opened the front door to his visitors. "Hello, Ken. I've only just heard," said Mr. Kelly. "I think Mr. Hollins has something to say to you, don't you?" he continued, now looking directly at Mr. Hollins. Mr. Hollins, shuffling his feet and looking down, muttered in a low breath, "Sorry, Ken. I was wrong to say you are fired. I was too hasty. Please come back." Ken beamed a huge smile. He disregarded Hollins' apology and looked directly at Mr. Kelly. "Thanks, Mr. Kelly. I won't let you down, I promise. I'm so glad. I was more worried you would tell us to get lost. As an extra welcome back gift, there's no need to come in the rest of the week, full pay, of course. Oh, and Hollins," turning to the shame-faced depot manager, "overtime rate, do you hear? He's been through enough." Hollins just meekly nodded. There were smiles of relief and handshakes between Ken and Mr. Kelly, and even a forced handshake between Ken and Mr. Hollins. The rest of the evening saw an unsettled Ken and his new lodger, Jack, try to plow on without Joel, but they didn't get anywhere, and as they were both worn out, called it a night. Chapter 6. Cover and Concealment. Next morning, Ken got up, put on his dressing gown, yawned, and went downstairs just as Jack was sitting up from his overnight slumber on the sofa. Ken did them both toast and coffee for breakfast, and then the postman delivered the morning's mail. There was only one letter on the hall floor by the letterbox. Ken picked it up, noticed that the postmark was local, and ripped open the envelope. Ken was surprised, and more than a little worried, to find it was from Graham Kitchener St. John. It read, "Dear R.P., I heard about your little accident with the laundry the other day. I must say, at the time I thought it was rather careless of you. I simply don't know how I would have been able to tell Peter his prized trousers had gone missing. So I was more than relieved to find out that I didn't have to. You could have knocked, you know, old man. I wouldn't have shouted at you or anything. When Rose came in, saying the trousers were hanging on the line, well, I just couldn't believe it. Still, you must have really pulled out all the stops to find them again, so well done. And here's a little something for your trouble. Best wishes, G.K. St. John. Out fell a 20-pound note from the fold in the letter. Graham Kitchener St. John must have been especially relieved to have given Ken a thank you gift. Ken made more tea and sat down to read and reread the letter. This was just through sheer desperation. He knew that nothing more could possibly be gained by doing this, but he did so anyway. But as for Jack, he had been in a world of his own thinking, and then he jumped up and yelled, "I've got it!" Ken, after applying his hands to his ears, asked him what, exactly, he had got. "It's tactics, that's all. Cover and concealment, hiding out. There is some defaulted information saved to the snip machine, stuff which would be applicable in most scenarios of this type. The trousers know they are being followed, so they have gone into hiding," explained Jack. "But we know where they are. How can that be hiding?" "Good point, but, well, maybe I haven't explained myself properly. Sometimes hiding and protection can overlap. Okay, we know where they are hiding out, but can we just go back to the St. John's and nick them?" slyly asked Jack. "Well, yes, maybe. Well, probably not," admitted Ken, knowing how zealous the St. John's would now be in protecting the old man's pride and joy. "Exactly, and the DJs know this. It's like they're blowing raspberries at us and going, na 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 na." "But if they're on a mission," said Ken, "what flaming use is that? And anyway, thinking about it, we probably could get them back, and quite easily." "How?" "By going round there. Tell your top brass to come along too, and then tell them all the truth." While Jack had to admit that this simple solution was indeed quite possible, it certainly wasn't something he wanted to do. Ken, I can't do that, honest. I'll be finished for good if we do that." "Why? How? What are you talking about?" demanded a confused Ken. "Well, I've already told you I've been in bother a few times, haven't I? Well, substitute a few times with loads of times and you may get the idea. If I get into bother one more time, I'm out for good. But surely they won't hold this against you, especially if you recover something that's top secret." "Been in the army at all, Ken?" "No, why?" "Didn't think so. I might still be out on my backside as it is, but while we have a chance of recovering the trousers on our terms, I may just be able to swing it to just a few days in the glasshouse." Ken thought for a moment, and then the truth dawned on him. Although the cause of all their woes and the solution were tantalizingly in reach, a more open, honest approach was out of the question. "Okay," Ken said. "Fair enough. But you still haven't answered my question. What use is it to hide in a house indefinitely when you're on a top-secret mission?" "I never said they'll stay there," answered Jack. "Not for long, anyway." "So when will they make their move, then?" "Tonight, under the cover of darkness." Ken thought and nodded in agreement. Such universal features of daring military missions, espionage, and war films did not escape him. "Well, what do we do then?" asked Ken. Jack, who had spent some time in the Strategy Operations Corps, although only as a young T-boy listening in, repeated a phrase he had heard often. Sacrifice a little to gain a lot.
Sacrifice what exactly? Replied Ken.
No idea. I just thought it might help.
As Ken muttered clot under his breath, Jack offered something which did make at least a little more sense. This is the most difficult part. It's a gamble, really. Although the trousers are super intelligent, it is still only the equivalent of one person, a genius and superhuman, admittedly, but still, only one person of sorts. I don't get you. Sorry, mate. Look, you've heard of, Einstein, haven't you? Yes, of course. What's he got to do with it? Can you imagine him making off with the entire food supply of a whole village? Yes, if he was still alive, but he's not, replied a puzzled Ken. Oh, replied Jack, and ignoring the lack of logic in his own supposition. But in one night? Yes, replied Ken. Oh, replied Jack. Well, okay. But, suddenly inspired, Einstein would not have been limited to the tactics of Happy Harold and his chums, now would he? Now do you see? Ken finally understood what Jack was trying to say. Yes, but you still haven't explained this sacrifice business properly, have you? Jack sighed and stood up. Stuff this, let's just wait until it's dark and go and keep an eye on the St. John's house. Fair enough, but you still haven't explained. Yes, let's wait until dark, agreed Ken, seeing the less than amenable look on Jack's face. Chapter 7. St. Leo of the Potatoes. It was tea time. Ken put some burgers on the grill and put the kettle on just as Joel turned up. As they ate their meal, Joel was brought up to date, and afterwards, with the dishes left unwashed, the three sat around the table and carried on reading the books which had been retrieved from the jeep. "Oh, flippin' Jiminy, superb!" exclaimed Ken. This brought immediate protest and scowls to match, from both Jack and Joel. But Ken was engrossed. Yet again, he forgot the very reason why he was reading a children's storybook, and was eager to know more of Happy Harold's adventures. And he recounted some of what he'd read thus far. It was Sunday afternoon, and Happy Harold was not so happy after all. The previous Sunday, he had been happily eating armfuls of scrumped apples with the village layabout, and had rather hoped to do exactly the same thing today. But it was not to be. For the last month, the mothers of the village had not done anything else but chatter among themselves, gushing with admiration for the sterling work being undertaken by the wife of the Honorable Dunstan Algrove, magistrate for Plumley and district. This was Mrs. Lavinia Algrove of Plumley Grange. The sterling work in question was the Sunday Glee Club. This was supposed to be a fun afternoon of music and friendship for the children of the village. For the children of the village, it was anything but. This was especially so for Happy Harold Spencer. The Glee Club had actually been up and running for almost a month. On successive Sundays for almost a month, Harold was nowhere to be found at what would and should have been the time of departure. Harold did not come home for Sunday lunch, preferring to go off on an unannounced picnic with a liberal share of equally unannounced, removed foodstuffs from the pantry. He went off, unannounced, to the canal bank, and who should be there waiting for him, looking rather grim, but his mother, unannounced. "Come along, Harold. Come and let Mrs. Algrove and all the children hear what a lovely voice you've got," said Mrs. Ivy Spencer, but without much conviction. Unfortunately for Harold, he did have a good voice for a 10-year-old boy.
and his mother was in tears one Christmas Eve as she secretly listened to him singing Silent Night. Harold had regretted it ever since. "But, Mum, I don't want to go. Old Jim Meary has asked me to help him pick some apples from Glumboyle's disused apple orchard." "You stay away from that man, Harold. He hasn't worked a day in years, and he's always drunk. He's a disgrace to the village and the whole county." Harold smiled to himself. He liked old Jim Meary, precisely because he was a disgrace to the village and the whole county. "But, Mum, Ripper Bullstock will be there. You don't want me and him fighting, do you?" "You don't have to worry there, dear. Lionel won't be going. He's got a heavy cold, his mother told me. He can't sing a note. Now, wrap up properly, dear, or you'll end up with a cold as well." The naive Mrs. Spencer hurried a now smiling Harold along to Plumley Grange, and, despite it being a cold, blustery day, Harold continued smiling as he slyly unzipped his duffel coat and, accidentally, lost his scarf in a ditch. A few minutes later they were passing the Bullstock residence, Credenza Rest. Harold couldn't help it, and glanced up at the bedroom. He could at least allow himself a little smugness that his arch-enemy was laid low. But as Harold stared upwards, smiling, the curtains opened. There was the gorilla-like Lionel Ripper Bullstock, in his silk dressing-gown, looking the picture of health. He had a huge gala apple in one hand and a bag of sweets in the other. He looked directly at Harold, pointed at him, then at the apple, and then ripped out a huge chunk of it with his teeth, mushed it up in his mouth, quickly opened his window and spat it out. He then threw the half-eaten apple out of the window, which hit Harold on the side of the face, which began to smart badly. "Anything wrong, dear?" asked Mrs. Spencer. Harold quickly rubbed his cheek and quickly waved his fist up at the window. "Oh, just gnats." Ripper heard a knock on his door, sneezed, coughed, and groaned, and jumped back into bed. "Oh, Mother dear, I feel so poorly," lamented Ripper. Harold and his mother arrived at Plumley Grange, a large manor house owned by the Algroves. Mrs. Spencer was asked into the library by Rosamund Algrove to look at some first editions of Dickens. Not the esteemed Charles, but Bill Dickens of Plumley, who had written 97 books on the habits and habitat of marsh lizards. Mrs. Spencer yawned, but feigned a smile at the same time. Mrs. Lavinia Algrove ushered Harold, the last to arrive, into the drawing-room. She was a small but fierce-looking lady with a badly wrinkled face, and wearing a mohair cardigan that was too tight, and riding-jawed purse which she never seemed to be parted from. The gathering of oppressed Glee Club members looked to their mistress. "Now then, children, Miss Farthing has told me that you sing this song in school all the time, so we'll begin with 'Oh, When the Saints.'" She lifted her baton and waved. 1, 2, 3. Most of the children sang in their usual demure, restrained manner, but not Harold. "Oh, achoo, 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 bend the braids, bar, achoo, sheen in, oh, bend the braids." "Stop, stop, stop! Harold Spencer, whatever is the matter?" "I bought a wolf, Mrs. Algrove. I Bobby. "Dear, dear, and you braved such a horrible day to come. Never mind, dear. You get yourself off home to some cocoa and a nice warm bed. I'll fetch your dear mother. I'm sure you'll be better for our next gathering. Oh, dear, we've lost 2 on the one day." Mrs. Spencer yawned as Mrs. Algrove's horsey-faced niece, Rosamund, commenced showing her the 38 stages of growth of the marsh lizard. They were on the third when she was urgently summoned to the drawing-room. On the way back home, Mrs. Spencer smiled without Harold noticing, and gave him an extra hard squeeze of his hand. They passed Farmer Glum's apple orchard, and Harold could only think of what might have been. Then they passed Farmer Glum's potato field, and Harold looked at the laborers digging the spuds up with their bare hands. There was a machine which could do the job, but it had broken down the previous day, causing much unwanted and unpaid Sunday overtime for the workers. The words of his kindly father, Mr. Bernard Spencer, echoed in his mind. If I could help make the lives of the farm workers easier, I would do it. Why does no one ever think of the other fella? Harold began to think of the other fella. In fact, he thought of nothing else for several days. Saturday came, Harold's favorite day of the week. No school, the best tea, and as many adventures that he could cram in between breakfast and supper. Harold was on his way to Glum's farm to put in some research work as to how he could best help the other fellows. A van drove down the lane at speed and passed Harold. It was the delivery van for Osterman's Clothes Shop in Andover, the nearest town to their remote village. So remote, Andover was over the border in the county of Hampshire. The owner of Osterman's liked to advertise the latest fashions on the store's delivery van. He used posters on the rear door to do so. But today, Toby Todd, the shop's odd-job boy, had been rather too sparing with the flour paste. A poster which should have proclaimed, Osterman's Clothes Store, or the discerning customer, sale of best leopard skin coats this Saturday, had been easily ripped to shreds by the force of the slipstream as the van sped along. This left the simple proclamation, St. Leo's Day. The fact that there were huge gaps between the letters, which would leave the grammar very much in doubt to even a below-average reader, held no such qualms for Harold. St. Leo's Day it was. The van still wasn't out of sight before Harold had decided on the venerable Leo's specialty, regardless of anything to the contrary printed in pamphlets or booklets available from the church piety store. St. Leo of the potatoes it was. Within hours, Harold had spread the word around that he was holding a St. Leo of the Potatoes fireworks festival. When challenged that there was no such person, Harold insisted that indeed there was, and that there used to be such celebrations years before, but George Lloyd, whoever he was, put a stop to such things at the same time as he brought in the earlier closing time for public houses. When asked if he really meant Lloyd George, Harold retorted angrily that he can't be expected to remember the name of every important person in history. "Well, what do you want us to do?" asked the suspicious children of the village, whom, upon remembering quite a few of Harold's previous harebrained plans, had good reason to be suspicious. "Bring all the fireworks you can, the more rockets the better, but any at all will help." "But my dad's only just bought them. He's saving them for Guy Fawkes night," said 10-year-old Danny Maybrick. "Look, St. Leo of the Potatoes got rid of all the marsh lizards, which ate the crops. In fact, the marsh lizards always come back each year on the same day. But there ain't no St. Leo anymore, is there? So we do what he would still be doing, if he was still here, which he ain't. So there, we'll plant the fireworks in the middle of all the spud plants and get rid of all the nasty thieving marsh lizards, just like St. Leo did." The subtle differences between a fireworks festival and a pest control program, both of which were the alternating public facade of a spud-picking exercise, were totally lost on the children, and were of no relevance or importance whatsoever to Harold. "I ain't got no dad. My mum buys the unsold fireworks the day after Guy Fawkes night, and saves 'em for next year 'cause they're heaps cheaper," said the poorest child of the village, the pale but pretty Betty Unsworth. This posed a problem for Harold, because his family had a soft spot for the Unsworths, and made sure they never went without the basics, and Harold secretly fancied Betty. But,
as sympathetic as Harold was, the needs of the one family could not take precedence over the needs of the great many other fellows and their families. Which is more important, remembering St. Leo of the potatoes, who got rid of all the marsh lizards which ate the crops, or some fella who was so stupid he climbs up on top of a fire and can't get down again, while all we had to eat were marsh lizards? "Why did we eat marsh lizards?" asked Tim Tucker, but not too enthusiastically, as he was Harold's best friend. "Because they had eaten all the potatoes," replied Harold, while glaring at Tim. Harold was on a roll. The children disbanded to go and gather all of their household fireworks. Later that night, Harold's scheme to make the lives of the other fellows infinitely easier and to make his father as proud as Punch came to fruition. He sorted out the many weird and wonderful fireworks into separate piles, and then allotted groups of plants a certain number of each type of firework to ensure, in his own words, maximum oomph. These were then tied to the plants. The mesmerized children then watched from a distance as Harold and 2 helpers made fuses from a number of bangers which had been cut open. Harold then marshaled his many admirers back to safety, walked back to the first fuse, and lit it with a match. 10 seconds later, boom, boom, bang, bang, boom, bang, shh, bang, boom, poof. This was followed by the equally loud shouts, cheers, hurrahs, and even the odd cheer of "Good old St. Leo of the potatoes!" Harold had assumed that all of the potatoes would be uprooted and jettisoned into the air, and then land in a small number of neat piles at strategic points around the field. The tired and hungry other fellows would then turn up for work the next day and see a full day's toil already completed for them, and, with the extra spuds which would surely be the case through Harold's infinitely more efficient method of picking spuds, see happy, cheery other fellows and their families sitting in the potato field roasting the extra spuds on open fires. He couldn't have been more wrong. What followed next saw the great big wide smile on Harold's face disappear in an instant. Thousands of spuds shot up into the air all right, but they also whooshed sideways along the ground, or went off at angles, just clearing the hedges. But not one spud landed where Harold thought it would have landed. Within seconds there were the sounds of screams, shouts, and yells from the village, glass smashing, wood splintering, metal denting, cats meowing rather too excitedly, and dogs yelping and barking and biting their innocent owners. One unlucky customer in the Bishop's Folly had been served a pint of the very brand new potato stout. When he complained, he was charged extra for the potato. Even around 100 deadly King Edward's potatoes reached the farmyard and flew in through the barn door, causing a stampede of cows, horses, and pigs. A now unconscious Farmer Glum was lying on the ground of his muddy farmyard, with 38 alien spuds about his person. At the same time, his young daughter, Tiffany, was about to tuck into a big bowl of vanilla ice cream and one whole, unpeeled, soily raw potato, due to her mother forgetting to shut the window. That night, not one single child from the village had to be threatened with no supper if they didn't come in. They were all curled up in bed and fast asleep by 7 o'clock. Harold heard a commotion downstairs. It may have had something to do with a rumpus at the farm, he wasn't sure. The feast day of St. Leo of the potatoes was over for a whole year, maybe for good. Well, very definitely for good, and therefore it did not concern him any more. Or he thought it didn't. After an expediently quiet Sunday for Harold, Monday morning arrived. Harold was, as usual, late for school. When he got there, he found more than his teacher, Mr. Bellard, standing at the front of the class. So was Farmer Glum, and next to him was Ripper Bullstock and his father, Brigadier Heath Bullstock. Harold was ecstatic. To get away with it was one thing, but to see his arch-enemy get the blame was perfection personified. "Here it comes," thought Harold. 12 of the best, never mind 6. "Here, lad, you deserve it," said Farmer Glum, handing a 10-pound note to Lionel Ripper Bullstock. "How you knew that this year's crop were ruined by marsh lizards I will never know, but your quick thinking has stopped them from moving on to the other fields." He turned to the beaming brigadier. "He's a chip off the old block, eh, Heath?" "Like father, like son, even if I say so myself," replied the equally smug brigadier, in his uppercut accent laced with gravel. Ripper grinned from ear to ear. He had suspected that Harold was up to something, and followed Harold and the rest of the village children to the potato field. He fled when the field was ablaze, only to bump into Farmer Glum, who had been thinking of something equally drastic to control the infestation of his crops. Ripper was delighted to admit it was all his doing. After the worried farmer did a jig of rural joy around the carrot field upon realizing that the marsh lizards were gone, for a year at least. "But," exclaimed Harold, but how?" But he then went very quiet as Ripper looked directly at him, grinning. But Harold was not dispirited for too long. His weary trudge home after school became a brisk walk, as he dreamed of untold vengeance upon his arch-enemy. "I know," exclaimed Harold, but only to himself. Ken, have you come up with anything? Ken! Eh? Oh, well, you see, it was the marsh lizards." Ken, although frequently told to move it along, and was even censured for his frequent fits of laughter, eventually relayed the mad goings-on involving happy Harold Spencer and the children of the village of Plumley. Sadly, this was not with a view as to how it would help them all in the current situation, but because he enjoyed it so much. After Ken had finished, Jack yelled, "That's it! He's going to blow up the potato field!" A plan was hastily put together. It wasn't a particularly brilliant plan, but they could not worry about that now. They would drive over to the St. John's place and nab the mischievous trousers as they sneaked out to commence their sabotage of the potato field. What they would do with them then was one example of why it wasn't that good a plan. They did not have a clue, but Jack muttered something about crossing bridges as they climbed into Ken's van to make the short journey to the St. John residence. Chapter 8. The chase is on. It took just under 5 minutes to get from Ken's house to Willow Crescent. They parked up on the opposite side of the road, 5 doors away from the St. John's house. The 3 men peered out of the van windows and looked diagonally across at number 41, Sunnyglade. The house was lit up, and shadows fell across the closed curtains every so often. "They're in, then. I was rather hoping they would all be out," said Ken. "Nothing's ever that easy in this game, Ken. Never," said Jack. "You're dead right there. Someone's looking at us from behind the curtains," noticed Joel. And indeed there was. There had been several break-ins in the area recently. Although the St. John's household had not been burgled, Graham Kitchener St. John put this down to vigilance and an eye and an ear for the untoward. This was his father's favorite saying from the Second World War, but like father, like son. "We'll have to go, knowing that lot. The police will be here any second." Their shadowing of the problematic pants came to an abrupt end only seconds after it had begun. Ken drove away, and just as he turned back onto the main road, he looked in his rear mirror to see a police car turning up at the St. John residence. Ken put his foot down to get to the main road as soon as possible. One van in a quiet suburban street was the van, whereas his van would soon be one van among many, and they would be safe. Or
he hoped they would be. Ken had not given a thought to the fact that his firm's logo was written in bright orange on both sides of the van. "Well, that's blown it. What now?" asked Ken. "Yes, bummer that. But, okay, we're not finished yet. We know the Trousers are going to try and blow up the potato field, so let's go there," suggested Jack. "Hang on! Blow it up with what?" spluttered Joel. "Fireworks!" exclaimed Ken and Jack at the same time. "But it hasn't got any fireworks." "Now correct me if I'm wrong, Jack," said Joel sarcastically, "but I don't think them boffins you mentioned rigged these things out with a box of Hockley's premium fireworks to go along with a compass, a penknife, and a tin of bullied beef, did they?" "No, I suppose not," admitted Jack, rather forlornly. Ken suddenly had a thought. He put his foot down hard on the brake, and as all three men were jerked forwards and only narrowly avoided banging their heads on the windscreen, Ken yelled, "Hockley's!" "What are you on about?" yelled Jack, who wasn't actually from the area. Joel banged his fist down on the dashboard. "Yes, Hockley's, of course," he agreed. Hockley's was a toy shop in Forbes Mallet. It also sold its own brand of fireworks. "You mean the Trousers are going to break in and steal all the fireworks?" asked Jack. "If it is going to carry out its mission, then I can't see it doing anything else." "Blinkin' Jiminy, Jack, you're the soldier around here," mocked Joel. "Yeah, fair enough. But this sort of thing is new to me as well, you know. No one ever told me that I'd be driving around the countryside with two civvies looking for a pair of trousers who think they're James Bond. It just wasn't in the job description." "Yeah, well, it is now," added Joel. "Let's get to the shop, and let's hope we're in time." They arrived at the shop 10 minutes later to find the shop door wrenched off its hinges and the burglar alarm blaring away. Jack was first inside the shop, followed by Joel, but Ken just happened to glance at a vehicle in front of the van. But it wasn't just any old vehicle. It was Graham Kitchener St. John's Pride and Joy, a soft-topped Morgan, a classic car from the 1930s. The top had been pushed back, and in the back seat was a box of Hockley's premium fireworks. "What the?" exclaimed Ken, his mind racing. But then something clicked. "We've been set up! The darn things have set us up! Get out of there! We've been set up!" Jack and Joel heard Ken loud and clear, and were back out of the shop in a flash. What neither Ken nor Joel noticed was that Jack's pockets were bulging. Seconds later, a police siren from a speeding police car, most probably the same car that had been called to the St. John's, let them know that they had indeed been set up. The police car was rapidly approaching the high street. "Quick! Get in! No, not the van, the car! It'll be quicker!" With such proverbs involving a sheep, a lamb, and a piece of rope racing around his brain, Ken climbed into the driver's seat. Joel sat next to him, with Jack in the back. "Drive, man, drive!" yelled Jack, as the police car was getting nearer and nearer. But the resourceful Trousers had thought this out very well indeed. Or, they thought they had. The keys were not there. But Ken smiled, put his hand underneath the seat, and produced a spare set. He turned to the other two. "I had to move his car for him once it was in the way. He told me to use the spares from under the seat." They had no time to talk of such a timely piece of luck. The police car was almost upon them as the red-striped Trousers suddenly drove off in a stolen car and roared past the amazed friends. They also witnessed one of the amazing abilities of the nuclear-powered DJs. The Trousers had extended themselves to take the shape of a full body, with arms, legs, a torso, and a head, all made of the same material the Trousers were made of. This included red stripes down the arms and 2 big red ears. It didn't seem to have any eyes, but that didn't stop it roaring off into the countryside, taking sharp bends at great speeds. Ken, Jack, and Joel were soon in pursuit, with the police car behind them and catching up. Within seconds, they reached the main gate to Packer's farm. The Trousers used their cloth hands with bright red stripes down each side to suddenly veer off towards the gate. Ken did the same. But then, just as Ken was almost upon the atomic Trousers on wheels, the Trousers pressed their cloth feet on the brake and turned the steering wheel full on. The noise was tremendous as the Trousers expertly skidded right around in a full circle, whipping up dust, grit, and cow manure, which flew into the windscreen of St. John the Younger's highly prized classic car. As the car sped off up the road and on towards Andover, Ken couldn't see a thing. Ken and his passengers hoped that if Ken kept straight, they'd be okay and could stop safely. Their hopes were in vain. Although Ken took his foot off the accelerator and slammed on the brakes, a crunching, splintering sound let them know that they had smashed right into the farmer's fence. The car reared up on its back wheels. The front wheels, now in the air, whined and flung the remnants of the cow muck all over the 3 friends, due to Ken's desperate attempt to reverse. The 3 occupants were flung forward and then back, but apart from minor cuts, gashes, and aching sides and ribs, just like in the accident which had brought all 3 men together, they were okay. All 3 jumped out of the car and ran to safety in case of an explosion. "What now?" asked Ken, still shaking from the collision and the realization that he was, as were his 2 new friends, criminals at large. In the eyes of the law, anyway. But before either could answer, the sound of the police siren let them know they were still being chased. Out of the "Quick! Hide in the hedge! Anywhere!" yelled Jack. All 3 dived into the hedge, just as the police car arrived and swerved to a halt. A big, fat policeman, rounder than both Ken and Jeremy Kelly, struggled to get out of the car, while his 2 slimmer colleagues jumped out of the back. It was at times like these that Detective Sergeant Ted Franks was glad that in his younger days he had reached the rank of sergeant, and was even more glad that his 2 colleagues had not. "They must be somewhere around the farm. In there now, after them!" barked Ted to his 2 slimmer and faster colleagues. But as one went to vault over the gate, the other had reached it already, lifted the latch and began to open it. His colleague was already in full leap when he took the full force of a heavy farm gate right in the stomach. As he lay there, winded, moaning and groaning, Ted Franks put his hands to his head in disbelief. "Buffoons, the pair of 'em. When we get back, I'll personally—" But he didn't have time to eulogize any longer on the dim-wittedness of his 2 flatfoots. The roar of an engine made him turn his head, to see the 3 criminals roar off in the police car, with Jack now at the wheel. Ken shook his head. "Stealing fireworks! Car theft! We've had it! How am I going to explain this away to Rita? I'll never know."
"You're forgetting one thing."
"We're innocent," declared Jack. "Innocent? What do you call this?" "Good point." "Yep, we've had it," conceded Jack, while Joel just sat there grim-faced. "Where are we going, anyway?" asked Ken. "I've an idea. Another gamble," replied Jack. "What's new?" mumbled Ken. "Pardon?" asked Jack. "Nothing." "What do you mean, gamble?" suddenly asked Joel. "We've been set up, right?" Jack began. "We've been bluffed. So we at least know the Trousers have the capacity to do this. So we take the only path open for us. We bluff them."
But what if they know that that's what we'll try? That's what they might be banking on. What then?
We go for a triple bluff,
replied Jack, but smiling with it. And what if they've already worked that out? Jack sighed. He wasn't smiling now. Look, if there's one thing I learned while handing out donuts and coffee to the intelligence wallahs, it's that there's only 2 bluffs in a bluffing scenario. The rest is just a bluff. Meaningless. And guessing a bluff is just that, a guess. We guess what these flaming hot pants are up to. If we're right, we win. If not, they do. Agreed? Agreed, replied Ken with a sigh. S'pose so, added Joel. But then he noticed something. Jack had driven at least 6 miles on from the supposed target, with the errant trousers nowhere in sight. Hey, where are we going? We're miles past the farm. Exactly, replied a now jubilant Jack. Now do you get it? He asked Ken and Joel. No, replied Ken. No, replied Joel. Jack gave out a huge groan, and then explained. This is the bluff. Our bluff. The trousers sped past us on the way to Andover, right? Do you see them now? No, came the double reply, but they were still none the wiser. Look, our friends the troublesome trousers think their bluff has worked. Well, it hasn't. We're going back to the field, like the Kecks no doubt have done, and we'll try and stop them. Trousers can't think, said Ken, without thinking. These ones can, said Jack. Oh yeah, forgot, said a foolish Ken, while Joel just smiled. A grim smile, but a smile. Put your foot down then, they've still got a good head start, said Joel. And what about the police? asked Ken. Don't worry, I've thought of that one, I hope, replied Jack. After 4 miles or so, Jack slowed down and pulled into a lay-by. The police will be looking for their car, not us. Now, help me push this into the hedge. Within a few minutes, the police car had been hidden behind a large hedge, and the 3 men walked on, along the inner edge of Packer's farm. Chapter 9. Adding fuel to the flames. The 3 men, now tired and more than a little fed up, eventually reached the edge of Farmer Packer's potato field. Look, there they are, whispered Ken. As they approached, they could see the trousers, now minus their extended pseudo-anatomical features, but they still seemed able to discern what was what, walking from spud plant to spud plant, bending at the knee, stopping a second, straightening up, and walking on again. It's Happy Harold all over again, observed Ken. Well, what would Ripper Bullstock do then? asked Joel. Spoil whatever they were trying to do, I suppose, replied Ken. But we're not bound by the books, are we? We can just go and nab them. Maybe we're not bound by the books, Jack replied, but I doubt whether we'll be able to just dash across and drag them off to wherever. Something tells me they'll be ready for anything like that. I think Joel's right. We may as well think like the kids from those books, and maybe then we've got a chance. A sudden whirring sound above them let them all know that maybe the police were not just looking for their car after all. It was a police helicopter. They had seen enough real crime TV shows to know that helicopters are used to locate fleeing criminals, and quite often across farmers' fields or anywhere out in the open. What do we do now? Whispered Ken, but it was a rather loud whisper. Shh, replied Jack. The thing is not to panic. I still don't think they've had time to find the car, so they are probably guessing whether we're still in it. If we avoid being seen, we might still be okay. I bloody well hope you're right, whispered Ken. Well, come on then. Let's get closer, but stay close to the hedge, or even in it if we have to, added Joel. The other 2 looked at him oddly, wondering if one really could get in a hedge. The 3 moved closer and closer to the atomic trousers with sabotage on their mind.
The trousers were now at the top end of the field as the three men reached the edge of the first line of potato plants. Tied along the stems of all the potato plants that they could see were rockets, Roman candles, and Catherine wheels, and several bangers or firecrackers scattered along the dividing mini furrows. Other fireworks, of varying size and potency, were simply scattered at random all over the field. Some had been split to make trails of gunpowder. Joel noticed that the rockets and bangers were not the same type he remembered from his childhood. They were all of the industrial or display standard and could do an awful lot of damage when used in the wrong way. Blinking heck! He'll blow the whole village up with these. The only light enabling the three men to keep track of the trousers was moonlight, but seconds later a cloud drifted across the sky, covered the moon, and the men were not able to see in front of their faces. When the cloud had drifted by and the moonlight returned, they could not see the trousers anywhere. "Oh, great! Just great!" yelled Ken. "Will you keep it down?" yelled Jack. Ominously mused Joel. "The whole county will be on to us now, not just the police. What a turn-up for the books this is! 2 civilians and a soldier jailed for car theft and ruining crops," again yelled Ken, who now thought their situation was hopeless. Retrieving a pair of mischievous trousers was one thing, but the possibility of being up in front of the beak after a night in the cells was quite another. "What a turnip, you mean," somberly joked the rustic Joel. "Blimey! Turnips!" yelled Ken. "Potatoes, turnips, what's it matter?" spluttered the sarcastic Joel. Ken had remembered an episode from the book which he had not yet shared with his friends. "Look, this was madness from the start. Well, for your information, our little friend will not be content with just ruining the spuds. He'll move on to the turnips and whatever else old Glumboil has got growing." "Who's old Glumboil?" asked Jack and Joel at the same time. But Ken just went grrr and waved his hands as if dismissing the whole sorry saga. But Jack had been frantically thinking on the hoof and came to the conclusion that all was not lost. "No, you're wrong. Sacrifice a little to gain a lot, remember?" But Ken was not convinced. "Not that again. I'm off. It's all over." He put his hands in his pockets and began to walk away. "What about your job, Ken?" shouted Jack. "I'll be sacked." "Again? That's what. Fat lot of use this is, running around the country in the middle of the night," retorted Ken, who just carried on walking. "Come on, Ken. We've come this far. We can't give up now. Even if we all lose our jobs, these things have got to be stopped before they cause real damage. 2 fields of veg is nothing, but what if they do something really bad?" Ken stopped and turned around. The other two were relieved, thinking that Ken had changed his mind. He hadn't. "Just call the army, the police, anyone. Just tell them the truth, like I wanted to before." While Jack gulped upon hearing this, Joel's face adopted a quizzical look upon realizing that this could be done easily enough, and wondered why they had not done so already. He lifted a finger, went to say something, frowned again, lowered his finger, raised it once more, lowered it again, and kept quiet. But Ken Rowley did not get to be one of the nicest men in the county by letting his friends down. Although he had only known Jack and Joel a short while, they were still friends. Ken walked on a little and stopped, just as Jack was quickly reformulating his earlier plan to vamoose. Ken clenched his teeth and again turned to face Jack and Joel. "Right. What's this sacrifice rubbish?" "Thanks, Ken. I owe you one," said a now smiling and highly relieved Jack. Running away would mean he was definitely finished. Staying to defend the local community must surely count in his favor. A year in the glass house is better than no career, and possibly no home, he thought. "Too right," replied Ken. "Well, come on. What's the plan?"
Right. We'll have to be extra cautious from now on. There's no doubt the trousers are watching us right now, and they may have been able to hear every word, so—" He now spoke in a whisper. "This is what we're going to do. We know that the trousers are deliberately staying one step ahead of us, and we also know that they would be tracked to the potato field, if he's sticking to the pattern of the Happy Harold story, that is." At this, Ken just nodded, while Joel adopted a hangdog expression. "Well, as bad as it will be for Old Man Packer, this is a sacrifice part. We sacrifice the spuds to save the turnips, but that's just a bonus. Our real aim is to surprise the trousers in the turnip field and capture them. I'm not too sure what we do then, but crossing bridges and all that." Despite Ken and Joel not being entirely convinced that such a plan would work, they both gave their agreement. "Okay, good," whispered a relieved Jack. "Now we know. The trousers are in the trees or hedges somewhere, watching our movements. Let's pretend we are going back to the road. As soon as we go around the bend, we'll be out of sight. Then we'll double back as quickly as we can to the turnip field. Then we'll see. Okay, then let's go." Ken, Jack, and Joel set off back towards the main road, and rather jauntily at that. It was as if they were on their daily constitutional. But as soon as they rounded a bend in the path, they darted onto the other side of the hedge and crept back along, staying low until they reached the next field up from the potatoes, which was full of ripe turnips waiting to be pulled up. "Well, what's next?" asked Ken. "My guess is the trousers won't know we are actually here waiting for them, and will be busy doing their thing. That gives us a little bit of time to try and prevent them from ruining both crops." "How?" asked Ken, with more than just a little doubt in his mind. Jack just gave a blank look. He hadn't got that far. "I know," said Joel smugly. "Water. If we can find a hose pipe, we can make the plants and the ground so wet the trousers won't stand a chance." "Brilliant!" enthused Jack. "Water? Where do we get water from this time of night? Oh, excuse me, Mrs. Glum. I know it's gone 3 o'clock in the morning, but we're busy trying to capture a pair of irradiated army kecks. Do you mind if we borrow 300 gallons of water?" said the very sarcastic Ken. "Who's Mrs. Glum?" said Jack and Joel at the same time. Before Ken could explain he was talking about the fictional farmer's wife, Joel noticed a shed at the end of the field. "There, look! I've driven past here loads of times. On hot summer days, the farm workers always use a hose pipe, which they drag out of the shed over there. We can use that." Ken just harumphed, but more to cover his embarrassment that he had been caught out, as there was indeed a copious supply of water to hand. "Okay," said Jack. "You two stay here and keep Dixie. I'll go and rig the hose pipe up." Jack stayed close to the hedge, stooping low as he made his way along to the little ramshackle shed. The lock to the door had been forced, and the door just swung open. "Oh, well, I wouldn't have expected anything less, flippin' yobs," he said to himself, and now thinking that if there ever was a hose, then there would not be one now. But he was wrong. Jack was amazed to find that a water hose on a metal reel was on the floor, with the hose seemingly attached to a water supply somewhere, as about 50 foot of hose ran from the reel out of the door and around the shed, further over towards a large tank. Jack was just about to run back and tell the other two of his find, when his face adopted an impish grin. He took the reel outside, pulled the end of the hose, and pointed the nozzle at roughly where Ken and Joel were still crouched by the hedge, and turned the hose on. Within 10 seconds, his impish grin became a look of horror. He could smell petrol coming from the hose. Luckily, the first few jets did not hit his two unsuspecting friends. "The sneaky blighter!" Jack roared. As Jack turned the hose off and was about to run back to the others, he could see a shadow in the distance beyond his friends. It was a glowing shadow of a pair of extended trousers with a red-striped cloth head, a red-striped body, and red-striped hands. Hands which now held a lit match. "Run, Ken! Joel, run! This way, now! The flippin' thing's new!"
Ken and Joel did not need any further prompting. They broke cover and raced away from the cloth-eared arsonist and towards the shed. Jack ran even faster, and in seconds had reached the far end of the field, just as the sly DJs nonchalantly dropped the lit match on the end of the fuse they had made from gunpowder, acquired by splitting open a few bangers. A second later, there was a huge boom, then another, then another. This was followed by a rapid succession of fireworks going off all over the field. The rockets shot up into the sky, taking soily clumps of turnip plants with them, so far up anyway, before they made their equally rapid descent at every angle, and in every direction. Bangers gave off lower octave bangs and booms, while at the same time aiding their rocket brothers in their ruthless form of turnip harvesting. Joel went to say something to the huffing and puffing Ken about hurrying up, but before he could utter a word, he was hit by a hail of turnips about the head and back, and collapsed on the ground. "Joel, are you all right?" yelled Ken, but before he could aid his friend, he was hit on the side of the face and head by another salvo of turnips as the last of the fireworks at the opposite end of the field exploded and delivered their organic missiles. Both Ken and Joel were moaning and groaning and rolling around in pain and in cow manure. What made matters worse was that the whole field and the surrounding hedges were now ablaze. "Come on, you two, the sooner we are up and away the better," shouted Jack, above the noise of the last defiant bangers and rockets, as he ran back to help them. As he helped his two aching, groaning friends to their feet, something happened which turned out to be the lucky break they had hoped for. In their attempt to stay ahead of their pursuers, the errant DJs made their first mistake. They had decided to move on to stage 2 of its operation, the potato field, by exiting through a gap in the hedge at the far end where the shed was situated, and then double back on the other side. The trousers, now back down to their simplest two-legged form, ran past the shed, and then suddenly found themselves going even faster, and not just on the ground, but through the air. Like so many hose pipes left to rot all winter in millions of garden sheds, this hose pipe had a number of holes in it, and had leaked a trail of petrol right along the furrows, around the shed, and even inside it. The trousers had piped the petrol from the nearby tank, which had been recently converted by Farmer Packer after improvements to the farm, which included a constant water supply obtained directly from the mains. But, unnoticed by the trousers, several petrol cans filled to the brim had been stored at the back of the shed. It only took one spark from the nearest rocket tied to the nearest turnip plant, and like a gunpowder fuse in almost every Western film ever made, a trail of fire led straight to the shed. Kaboom! Boom! Kaboom! Ken, Jack, and Joel were making their way back along the edge of the field towards the farmhouse, and hopefully to safety, when they again had to take shelter, but not from the raging inferno, nor the mad trousers. It was Farmer Packer, standing there in his dressing gown and brandishing a shotgun. "Who's there? Come on out. I'm not scared of you. How many times have I told you lot I'm not selling, do you hear? Kaboom! Boom!" This was a second explosion from the shed, which was now no longer. "What the? Doris, get back inside. The police will be here soon." The rather plump lady of the house and the farm, wearing a hairnet and pajamas with pictures of pink piglets all over them, ran from behind her husband and back into the house. Jack had seen the spectacular rise and fall of the trousers, and beckoned to the other two that it was time to go, whether with an angry farmer on their tail or not. They hoped to run around to the other side of the hedge and away, knowing that Farmer Packer had heard them, but could not see them. But as they ran nearer to him in the dark to reach the turnaround point, Ken trod on a twig, which then snapped under his feet. Farmer Packer did not need any further prompting. He aimed and fired. The three men ran off as quick as they could, holding their backsides as they went, despite Farmer Packer missing the target.
Although he was an old man, he was a good shot in daylight, but it was the middle of the night, and the clouds had blocked out the moon. He replaced the cartridges, fired off both barrels, which again missed, and then lowered his shotgun. He sighed, scratched his head, looked around at his burning field, and went back inside, where all he could do was sit and wait for the emergency services. Although the rockets and bangers were well spent, the final and more decorative fireworks still whizzed and footed and sparked and sparkled, while some, nearing the end of their life, still shot up from the ground in one last, defiant act of destruction. The three men stayed on the outside of the turnip field as the fire worsened rather than lessened. As well as the green foliage blazing away, hay bales were on fire, along with compost heaps and other combustible materials scattered around the field. They walked carefully on past the end of the smoldering turnip plants, and past the burning timbers that were once a shed, to where the trousers lay, lifeless, on the ground. The men stopped and looked at each other. "Well, shall we?" asked Ken. But before either Jack or Joel could reply, the trousers were up and away, again. The three men were full of mud, and worse, were wheezing with the effects of the smoke, and were absolutely exhausted. They had no chance of catching the runaway DJs. They stood at the end of the field, watching the trousers commence phase 2 of its deadly vegetable harvest. "That's torn it, and to think we nearly had the blighters!" exclaimed Jack, just as a succession of booms, bangs, and another light show let them know that phase 2 had commenced. Seconds later, the potato field was ablaze, just like the turnip field. "Huh, there goes the spuds after all. Well, we knew that, didn't we? Oops," said Ken. "Oops? What do you mean, oops?" "Sorry about this, fellas." Ken looked down. "But, in the book, the turnip field was blown up first. I skipped a few pages by accident, so I went back to read them. I just I got mixed up." "Well, that was a good plan, once," said the rueful Jack. Ken, despite all three friends quickly adding arson to their list of perceived misdemeanors, forgot the trouble they were in and chuckled merrily away. "Oh yeah, you see, Ripper Bullstock suspected Harold was going to pull some caper, so threatened Tim Tucker, one of Harold's gang, with a dip in the sewage silo if he didn't tell. So you see, ha ha ha, hee hee, so Ripper nixed some of the fireworks and rigged the turnips up. He figured even if Harold's plan worked, he'd still get in trouble for blowing up the turnips oh, I see. Sorry." Jack and Joel looked at Ken with looks of disbelief and anger on their faces. "Unbelievable! We could have stopped all this nonsense, but no! You were so engrossed in the antics of some pseudo-thug of a schoolboy who doesn't even exist that our plan would never have worked in a million years. What a waste of time!" yelled Jack, who wondered if the travel agent stayed open late, or if he could book a one-way ticket to Timbuktu over the internet. Joel just sighed and flopped down and sat on the ground. Ken was feeling particularly bad. Yet again his being engrossed in the capers of a fictional schoolboy decades before had taken his mind off the task in hand. He began to think hard as to how he could repair the damage. This was not made any easier by Jack and Joel remaining silent. They weren't sending him to Coventry, although this is what Ken thought they were doing, but simply deep in their own thoughts, pondering on the situation they were in and how they could get out of it. But Ken couldn't stand it any longer. "Look, there must be some way to stop these things. Surely those boffers you mentioned have got some gizmo stashed away. If you could, borrow such a thing, then we'll be okay," suggested Ken, but rather desperately. "Yes, there is. No, we can't. And it's boffins. The mainframe, as well as the portable mini deactivator, are in the most closely guarded rooms in the barracks. We've no chance," sullenly replied Jack. "Where's a computer hacker when you need one?" suggested the rueful Joel. Yeah, I know. No chance of finding one in this backwater, is there? Joel, you little beauty. Jack jumped up, clenched his fist, and punched the air. What on earth got into you? Asked Ken. Yeah, come on, Jack, what do you mean? Added Joel. I was one of the team working on the commands for the implanted objects. I even had to go to Cape Canaveral for 3 months to get to grips with the American formatting. If we can find an online computer, we can control them. I know the passwords and what to say, everything, explained Jack. Well, why on earth didn't you say this before? Demanded Ken. I just didn't think. And anyway, I was only training. I'm not authorized to use the mainframe on my own or access it by remote or anything like that. That doesn't matter now, spluttered Ken. Now, back to my place. We can access the internet from there. The 3 men commenced the long, tiring, and wet slog, as it was now raining heavily, back to Ken's home. They were careful to stay hidden, keeping close to the hedging on the inside of the farmer's field, and getting very muddy, and worse. Chapter 10. http://www.snip.co.uk. Ken, Jack, and Joel gave sighs of relief as they left behind the dark country lanes and once again reached the village of Forbes Mallet. As they approached Ken's home, they all groaned. 2 policemen were standing on guard, with another sitting in the lounge, watching Ken's TV and eating crab sandwiches. The darn cheek of the man, breaking in so he can watch cable telly. I'll bet he's cleared out the fridge as well. Well, what do we do now? Asked Joel. I know. Don't worry, said a mysterious Ken. He took the loose change from his pocket and led his 2 friends down a rarely used back lane to a public phone box not far from his home. A few moments later, Yes, dear, now don't worry. I'm sure it will all be sorted out in no time. Now promise me you will say what I've asked you to say, word for word. Got it? Good. Yes, love you too. And say hello to everyone for me. I'll see you all soon. Promise. What's that? Ken now turned his back on his 2 friends, who were waiting at the side of the open-air phone kiosk. He whispered, Flupsy Wupsy loves his little Flopsy Mopsy. Ken put the receiver down and hoped that the other 2 had not heard the latter part of his conversation. What now, Flupsy? Asked a grinning Jack. Ken led them even further along the lane, and once more in through a gap in the hedge. We'll have to wait a while. I reckon 20 minutes should do it. Do what? Asked Joel. Just wait, replied Ken. The telephone rang in the hallway of Ken's home. P.C. Jerry Carter jumped up and looked through the window over to his 2 comrades. Sergeant Franks gestured with his hand for the P.C. to leave the phone and to let it go to the answering machine, which is something that Ken had not thought of, and left a worried Mrs. Rowley floundering, but not for long. Hello, Jeff, it's Mum here. I've a favor to ask. Your father's had to go on an urgent errand to Scotland with a couple of, new friends of his. I'll explain it all when I see you. Anyway, I want you to draw £1,000 out of your savings account. Don't worry, you'll get it back. Send it to the Tobermory Hotel in Wick. Transfer it online if you can. He's there now and he's running short. Right. I'll have to go, son. You will do this straight after getting this message, won't you? Bye. Love you. Within seconds of the phone going dead, P.C. Carter, after hastily checking a copy of the Gazette of the British Isles, dragged off Ken's bookshelf, ran out of the door, shouting, "They've scarpered to Scotland!" With a squeal of the brakes, the police were gone. A short while later, Ken and Joel were stood either side of Jack, who was sat at Ken's computer. He was nervous and sweating profusely as he inputted security codes and passwords issued to him in the strictest secrecy, and with dire warnings of what would happen to him if he abused these privileges. "Can't worry about that now," he muttered under his breath, while worrying very much about it now. Jack rather pathetically tried to shield the screen from an amused Ken and Joel as he inputted various codes and passwords. A message flashed up on the screen. "Initiate remote contact? Yes. Press Enter. No. Press Escape." Jack selected Enter. Within seconds, the screen changed from the standard gray to a blue background, and Jack was prompted for even more security codes. "Snip Operative 39, acknowledging Control Center. Verify Controller." Jack typed, "Control Center JAANONECORPTRNG." There was a 10-second delay, which seemed an eternity to the three men, especially Jack, who was having to mop his brow every 5 seconds. "Verification successful. Instigate interaction program." Jack typed, "Mission status report program." There was another 10-second delay. Then, "Mission accomplished. Final rendezvous confirmation." Jack typed, "Rendezvous request. Proceed as per Control Center default." There was an even longer delay. Jack sweated even more and snatched up a tea towel to mop his brow, left rather lazily by Ken on top of the TV. Eventually, there was a reply. "Rendezvous point 2, 0345 hours CD." Jack replied, "Mission status acknowledged. Rendezvous point 2 verified and concurred. Over and out." The screen went black. "Well?" immediately demanded Ken. "Just give me a sec, will you? I feel as if I've lost 20 pounds here." "Come on, Jack. I'm still supposed to be in work later on. I didn't think I'd be up all night," protested Joel. "Right," replied a businesslike Jack, now standing with his hands in his pocket by the fireplace, like a proud father in any old kitchen sink drama. "It thinks I'm his controller, which I am, in a way. It's now making plans to scarp her. Rendezvous 2 is always the departure point after a mission has been completed or aborted." "Where is that, then?" asked Joel. "I know," cut in Ken, thinking back to Happy Harold and his chums, but not laughing on this occasion. "The railway station. That's the only likely place as far as the book is concerned, anyway. And he also had input from that travel book. It must be the railway station." After a slight delay, while Jack mysteriously raided Ken's fridge, they rushed back out of the house. "To the railway station!" shouted Joel in a very animated fashion, and pointing the way, like some sort of deranged superhero. "Oh, yeah," said an amused Jack. Ken just smiled. Joel was still pointing the wrong way as Ken and Jack walked off in the opposite direction. They trudged down the road, trying to stay in the shadows so as not to attract attention. "Evening, Ken. Took to burglin' now?" asked one night owl who knew Ken from the bowling club. Ken just nodded and smiled. It was only after 5 more "Evening, Kens," which saw them reach the outskirts of the village of Forbes Mallet. They walked down the dark, badly lit, tree-lined pathway, which took them to Forbes Mallet railway station. This had been earmarked for closure many years earlier, along with many other branch lines and their stations, but these proposals had been strongly opposed. The leader of this revolt, a Professor Nimby Meaching, smiled down upon the grateful travelers, courtesy of a poster-sized picture of the said professor attached to the station arch. As Professor Nimby Meaching's work took him to London every day, he rallied as much support as possible to save this vital artery. But back to the three friends, who didn't quite make it to the station. "Ow, ow, ow!" suddenly yelled Ken. "Ow, ouch!" shouted Joel. "Oh, ouch!" yelled Jack, even louder. The three friends were hit by a broadside of stones, chestnuts, and even a variety of displaced tree knots. They found themselves forced over to the side of the pathway and hid behind an old oak tree. "What the flippin' Jiminy was that?" exclaimed Ken. "Bloody yabos," replied Joel, "and at this time of night as well." "No, you're both wrong. They've rumbled us again. It's the trousers," dolefully explained Jack. "Rumbled? But you said you could control them," spluttered Ken. "I must have made a mistake in the passwords, or commands, or something. If the implant suspects a problem, they may well play along, and then turn the tables on whoever has activated the control program." "Huh? Us, you mean?" humphed Ken. "Yep, he's foiled us. Only one thing to do," said Jack. "Go home?" ruefully suggested Joel. "Nope. Eat, drink, and then prepare for battle." "Oh, yeah. This is out in the sticks, mate. No burger bars here, and even if there was, it wouldn't be open now," said Ken, very sarcastically. "One for you, one for you, one for me." Jack handed out a jam sandwich each to his astounded comrades in arms, and then passed around a bottle of flat lemonade. "It's what Happy Harold would have done, isn't it?" Ken and Joel could do nothing but agree, and they all sat against the thick base of an old oak tree to tuck into their schoolboy fare. But Ken secretly wished they were emulating Ripper Bullstock. He would have had a hamper of smoked salmon and a bottle of chilled champagne, or at least his father would have done. One Brigadier Heath Bullstock. Chapter 11. Yabos. Half an hour later, three damp, but now fed and watered friends stood up from the base of the oak tree. Ken removed an earwig from his underpants. "What's this battle business, then?" Ken asked Jack. "Thought you were never going to ask," smiled Jack. He passed them both a handful of pebbles and a catapult each. "And," replied Ken, "use your imagination. The trousers have obviously decided to fight instead of run, so we fight. I'll stand in the middle of the path, shouting to get their attention, and then, when you get a general idea of where they are hiding, fire off as many pebbles as you can. One's bound to hit them at some point, and will either knock them down from the tree, or they'll jump down and run off. We'll chase after them then." Ken put his hand over his enormous stomach and cast his mind back to his last school sports day. Ken was huffing and puffing away in last position in the cross-country just as he had reached the village. He called in at Shorten's pie shop and slowly munched his way across Farmer Packer's field, an excellent shortcut as well as an excellent pie, and finished a respectable, but none the less highly unsporting 18th. Yeah, okay," said Ken, but without much conviction. "It's all right, Ken. I'm in good shape, and I'm sure Jack's as fit as a fiddle," said the caring Joel. "Right, stay here, you two. This is it." Jack walked into the middle of the pathway, lit by one solitary street lamp. "Well, we're here. Come out and face us. You're nothing but a souped-up tea towel, a cloth head, nuclear trousers. You couldn't fight your way out of a wet paper bag. Come on, show yourself. You're no match for us. Come on, cowardly Ow, ow, ow!" 2 pebbles and a small piece of dead wood hit Jack on the head. He ran back into cover, rubbed his head, and then rallied his troops. "Ready?" Within seconds, a hail of pebbles were fired into the trees on the opposite side. Nothing. not for a few seconds anyway. But a few seconds later, the three friends were yelping in pain again as they were pounded by another incoming broadside. Jack and Joel still managed to laugh, as Ken now had a plastic arrow with a flat rubber tip attaching itself to Ken's forehead. But Ken wasn't laughing as he ripped the arrow off his head and threw it onto the lane. "Where on earth did it get the bow and arrow from?" chuckled Joel. "Hockley's. It's a toy shop as well. Ouch!" replied Jack. "But two can play at that game." Ken remained silent and indignant. "Jam buddies? Catapults? You think of everything, don't you?" "Ow, flippin' Jiminy!" yelped Joel, after 3 pebbles hit him one after the other on his ear. "Yep. Ow! Come on, again!" yelled Jack, rallying the troops. The 3 friends forgot their aches and pains and fired off another salvo of pebbles, but again they had to retreat as there was indeed more incoming. "Okay, we go again, but one at a time, and don't keep still. Run and throw. Come back, and then the next, and so on." Ken, thinking it the right thing to do, pulled the most ferocious face he could, despite no one being able to see it. "Yarg!" yelled Ken as he ran out, fired off his pebbles as best he could, and returned to the shelter, huffing and puffing. Jack and Joel looked at each other and shrugged their shoulders. Jack ran out, zigzagged down the lane, fired off 9 pebbles in quick succession into the trees, and was then hit in the face by the stout end of a twig. He returned to his friends while rubbing his cut cheek, but Joel had an idea. He crouched and ran down the near side of the lane, around the bend, crossed over, and sneaked back along the inside of the trees. He fired off 5 pebbles, but all in the same direction, which was near to the top of the tallest oak tree. During Jack's ill-fated sortie, he thought he had seen the red stripes of the trousers, reflected momentarily in the moonlight. He was right. There was a creak and a twang of a branch as the trousers were knocked down, out of the tree and down onto the lane. But they quickly recovered their composure and began to run. "We've got 'em or them! Come on, after them!" yelled Jack. It wasn't long before there was distance between not only the trousers and the 3 men, but between Jack and Joel, who were both strong runners, and Ken, who was sweating and breathing heavily and had a stitch in his side. It would have been even worse if he had decided to run. Despite Jack and Joel doing their best, the chase seemed to be over as the trousers raced ahead and disappeared round a bend. But then fate intervened in the form of a speeding cavalcade of police cars and army jeeps. Ken's ruse about fleeing to Scotland had just run out of steam, but it had bought them some time. Still, the very experienced Chief Inspector Johns of the County Constabulary, well used to the devious nature of criminals, had simply telephoned the Tobermory Hotel in Wick. They were closed for renovations. Add to this one frantic telephone call from a worried resident concerning, quote, "a very noisy pair of trousers" in the vicinity of Forbes Mallet Railway Station, and the police were now back on the trail of the 3 fugitives, and now the trousers as well, if they existed. The station master's wife had heard the row and had even seen the trousers run off as she shook like a leaf while peering out from behind her lace curtains at the little cottage attached to the station. Unfortunately for Dora's Goodspeed, her husband, Langton, who kept up the long tradition of station masters keeping a fine garden, was away in Wales. He was showing off his prize cucumber at the Rhondda Valley Organic Farmers' Show. It may have been unfortunate for Doris, but this was very definitely fortunate for Ken and his friends. Many a late-night yawbo and others had found themselves baring their buckshot-sequined backsides to the amused casualty nurses working the night shift at Andover General Hospital. Station Master Langton Goodspeed always gave a grim smile of satisfaction as he saw Yabos stagger away, holding their smarting buttocks as they went. "And to think I fought for this lot," was his stock phrase, which he uttered as he replaced the shotgun on its rack, and duly sent Genghis the Doberman down the lane, "just to make sure." The last, "Yabo," to be seen off so thoroughly, turned out to be a Seville Row suited executive of an oil company who had just missed the last train. As the speeding convoy approached both the hunted and the hunter, the trousers simply extended themselves to full body form and scrambled up the nearest tree, unseen. At the same time, Jack and Joel jumped in a ditch, while Ken, who decided to rest a while, simply sat at the side of the road and getting covered in mud as the convoy whizzed past him. Within seconds the chase was on again. The trousers now decided to take advantage of the roofs of the houses and cottages, as they had now reached the edge of the village. He leapt from the tree onto the first rooftop. Jack and Joel, despite tiring themselves, did their best to keep up from the roadside. Jack, like the true professional he was, even fired off 3 pebbles from his catapult as he ran on, but all 3 missed their target by a long way, and the pebbles plopped harmlessly down into a mill pond at the back of one of the cottages. Meanwhile, Ken stood up, wiped the copious amounts of mud from his hair, eyes, and face, and then jumped up and down in rage and frustration in the middle of the lane. With a big sigh, he then did his best to catch up with the others and the action. The nuclear britches now had their own problems. The rooftops were not now as near to each other as they had been, and the gap between the one where they were and the roof of the next cottage was more than 30 yards. Again in their basic form, they stood, crouched ever so slightly, as if in deep thought, wondering whether to go for it. They had decided, yes, they were going to try and jump the 30-yard gap, and again put the distance between them and their pursuers. By this time, Jack and Joel had caught up. "This could be it," said Jack. "They'll be able to jump far higher and longer than the best athletes, but that doesn't mean they'll definitely be able to clear that gap, and they may not have fully recovered from being thrown by the blast. Be ready to nab them if they fall." They walked up the gravel path of the cottage and went to the side, which was a connecting side lawn between the 2 cottages. The trousers, sensing they had company, turned, gave at the knees, and stopped, as if staring right down at Jack and Joel. Then they turned back, seemed to compose themselves despite being still bodiless, and then suddenly went off at a run. They reached the guttering at the edge of the roof and took off. Jack and Joel, and now Ken, who was only yards from the cottage, could only marvel at the sight of a pair of ceremonial red-striped regimental trousers, or DJs, as they seemed to fly across the sky. The red stripes shone in the moonlight, and the silver and gold buckles sparkled momentarily, as the street lamps shone upon them. They flew higher and higher, and further, and were nearing the next rooftop. They began to descend, closer and closer, faster and faster, and missed. They flopped against the wall, falling short of the rooftop by just a few inches. They then made an even quicker descent down an old disused water pipe attached to the side wall of the cottage. The 3 men, now united again, were not sure if they were happy or sad. It was a magnificent effort, which, for a split second in all their minds, seemed to deserve better. But Jack shook them up from such ironic musing. "Come on, they could be up and away in seconds. Don't forget, they're not human. Come on!" The trousers sat up from the ground. Although there was no head or hands, it was as if they were rubbing an aching bonce and an equally bruised and aching backside. But just as the three men approached, the trousers were up and away, yet again. The men gave long, low groans, so near and yet so far. But the early light of a midsummer dawn gave them renewed hope. This time, the only route open to the runaway Keks was a series of back gardens to the long row of cottages, each with a partitioning fence in between. No sooner had Ken and his friends resumed their pursuit, they heard the telltale sounds of the police cars with their sirens on full blast, and what could only be a sergeant major of Her Majesty's Army yelling from the lead jeep. The convoy screamed and scrunched to a halt on the lane. "Get after them now, you useless piles of horse manure! If them blue hats beat us to it, your lives won't be worth living. Move it, men, now!" With the three friends well at the front of the chase, everyone was once again in hot pursuit. The trousers vaulted a fence, just as the lady of the house, Mrs. Toms, dutifully arose from bed to let Bojangles, the tabby cat, back inside, after an all-night sing-song with a pack of feral friends. With its nearest pursuers 2 gardens back, the trousers, with only a split second to spare before being spotted, flung themselves onto Mrs. Tom's washing line. The old lady waited patiently at the back door until finally, after flicking his tail at his fellow carousers, Bojangles appeared, brushed past the old lady's leg, and went off to get nice and snug in his basket. As his devoted owner went back inside, the trousers regained animation and resumed their hurtling over the garden fences. Old Harry Hobbs was another nocturnal member of the community. He had suffered badly from indigestion for years, and was often up in the middle of the night to take his much-needed medication. Old Harry downed his milk of magnesia, looked out of the kitchen window, and smiled. He was treated to a grandstand view of the most bizarre police and army chase since the days of silent film. Reminds me of when I was a lad in the Tumpanies. Come on, Charlie, and you, Buster. The 2 heroes from the golden age of silent cinema were, in fact, the 2 bobbies who had pursued the 3 friends earlier on to old Packer's farm. At first, they vied for prime position in the chase, with their bigger, fitter, and tougher army allies. But what followed was inevitable. The 2 policemen were soon left behind, crouched in the garden of one Mrs. Annie Turtle, winded, and with one of them vomiting. This unfortunate occurrence did not placate the anger of old Mrs. Turtle, as she beat them both about the head with her broom. Old Annie most certainly was not nocturnal, and took great exception to being woken up by such a terrible din, and she took even greater exception to vomiting policemen. "Get out of my garden! Disgusting! Absolutely disgusting!" Back in the police car, Sergeant Franks banged his fists on the dashboard. The strange thing was, the ends of the gardens did not have hedging or fencing, and were accessible from the open road, and so Ken, who could not possibly have vaulted any of the fences, simply walked as fast as he could along the lane, hiding in the opposite hedge if he thought he was about to be spotted. "Idiots," he muttered, and he wasn't referring to either the police or the army. Ken was able to make his way along to the last cottage ahead of the chase, as the cottages went around and away in a semicircle, whereas the lane was reasonably straight. At the side of the last cottage was not so much a garden, but a large gravel-covered area. Here Ken espied what he thought could be their next escape vehicle. There were 2 to choose from, a whacking huge tractor and an old rusting motor car. Meanwhile, the trousers had vaulted all 7 fences so far, but when it was at the 8th, which was the last fence between the last 2 cottages, they noticeably slowed down, just about scrambled over, and flopped onto the ground. Ken saw this, couldn't believe his luck, and ran across and picked them up. just as Joel and Jack vaulted over, nearly knocking Ken down. "What?" went to ask Jack, but was cut off by Ken. "No time! The squatties are almost here! Quick! Choose tractor or motor!" After a dual reply, which to Ken sounded like track-mo-actor, they decided on taking the car. "But there's no keys," suddenly noticed Joel. "Close your eyes. What you don't see won't hurt you," shouted Jack. Ken and Joel reluctantly joined in this ill-timed game of peekaboo, and seconds later the engine roared into life. Old it may have been, but it still worked, and with a full tank of petrol. "Wait!" shouted Ken. "What now? They'll be here in a second!" yelled Jack. "What use is this?" said Ken. "They'll simply come after us in the cars and jeeps. We can't outrun them in this old heap. We need a diversion," replied Ken. Joel had been looking at the tractor. "Quick!" Joel said. "They probably won't know there's two vehicles. Jack, go and drive the tractor. I'll drive this in front. They'll only be able to see the tractor, and by the time they're back on the road, we'll be miles away." "But they'll still catch us up," yelled Ken. "I don't think so," said Joel. "We'll jam the accelerator on the tractor and send it over the fields. It's 6 miles of flat ground. No one will get hurt, and by the time they realize it's a trick, we'll be in the army camp, the last place they'll expect to find us." Ken grinned and thumped Joel in the arm. "Ow!" said Joel, while Jack jumped in the tractor, did his thing, and it duly roared into life. The two vehicles moved out onto the road just as the squatties vaulted the last fence. "The stupid morons!" the squatties exclaimed. "We'll be up with them in less than a minute. Fred, get on the radio. Jeeps now!" yelled one of the soldiers, upon seeing a whacking great tractor trundle away down the road. In less than 5 minutes, the police and army had regrouped and were busy chasing the tractor over the well-plowed farmer's field. "It's worked!" exclaimed a jubilant Ken, looking over at the strange convoy while he and his friends drove off towards the army base. Joel gave Ken a smug smile, although his arm still ached. "Sorry," said Ken. Not too long after, a strange gathering of army top brass, the police commander for the district, and a hodgepodge grouping of soldiers and policemen looked down at the unmanned tractor, now in a ditch 6.5 miles away from the village of Forbes Mallet. The squatties boast that they would be up with them, quote, "in less than a minute," had been proved entirely wrong. As well as going in the wrong direction, the furrows made over the years by a variety of tractors and plows had severely hindered the usually tough, relentless army jeeps. The less said about the current state of 3 police cars, the better.
Chapter 12. A Roomful of Brass. Ken, Jack, and Joel were now able to relax a little as they drove along the road, free of their pursuers, for the moment anyway. "Here's us thinking a pair of moldy old trousers had got the better of us. No chance!" crowed Joel. "Not that tough after all, eh?" agreed a jubilant Ken. But Jack, mystified as to the unexpected humbling of a pair of supercharged nuclear trousers, had been thinking about the wall of the cottage, or more precisely, the old pipe. This had been the trousers' undoing. The reasons why this was finally became clear. "Not quite, fellas, not quite. We've won all right, but it's nothing to do with our efforts, nor their smashing into the wall. We've been able to capture the trousers because they came across the arch nemesis of all things atomic." "Stop gibbering! What do you mean exactly?" demanded Ken. "Yeah, what load of old tosh is that?" agreed Joel.
Lead piping, to be exact. It's all about balance, you see. Sure, the trousers are nuclear, but the levels had to be just right. Thankfully, the boffins were able to set the limits to make it safe for humans. But anything nuclear will always be affected by lead, or anything with lead in it. Now, these type of pipes were not pure lead. If they were, they would have been removed years ago, safety laws and all that. But there's still enough lead in them to counteract the effects of small amounts of anything radioactive, or nuclear, or atomic, or whatever. It's the lead which has stunned, I suppose is the word, the trousers. But for how long, I've no idea. What's the difference between them all? That's always been a mystery, that, asked Ken. Dunno, mate. I was only the tea-boy, remember? Replied Jack, who had simply repeated, parrot fashion, conversations among boffins of things nuclear, atomic, or radioactive. Yeah, well, what now? Asked Ken. Well, it depends. If we go to my superiors now, the old man will never see his trousers again, which would be bad news for you, Ken. You, Joel, will need your books back, won't you? Not Arf. Your mob have threatened to close my lot down if they don't recover all their copies of the exercise plans. If that happens, I'm out on me year as well, and that's on top of things being slack at the moment anyway. I was sorely tempted to give the copy we've got straight back to 'em, but I didn't want to let you two down. Well, Jack shrugged. What happens to me won't change much now, anyway. So, if you two want to keep your jobs, I think we should sneak into camp and deactivate the trousers. We'll keep the books handy just in case. Afterwards, everybody gets what they want, but on our terms. Agreed? Well, yes, but you yourself said the room with all the gizmos in is the most guarded room on camp, said Ken. I think I know a way, replied Jack. They drove on, getting near to the camp, but Jack told Joel to pull up by a public telephone box. Jack repeated a little joke that had got him one of his spells in the glass house a couple of years previously. On this occasion, he had announced over the camp PA system that all drinks in the camp bar were on him for the entire evening. The him in question was none other than the commander of his regiment, General Lewis Argencourt Hicks, of whom Jack could do a perfect impersonation, of the voice anyway, which was all that was necessary right now. Jack rang the guardroom of Hinchminster Barracks. "Hello, duty guard's office," said the voice on the other end of the line. "Is that you, Corporal Lennon?" asked the counterfeit General Hicks, in a grated, gravelly, too many cigars, upper crust type voice. "Yes, sir, Corporal Lennon speaking, sir." "Well, don't just stand there, man. Call the camp out. Get 'em all out. Get 'em out of there kipping over to Andover bus station. Those nuclear trousers have gone berserk. Hurry, man." "Is that you, Jackie?" was the chuckleful reply. Jack coughed and spluttered in pretend rage. "What the devil? Now listen here, Lennon. Any more impertinence from you, and I'll have your stripes. Now do as I say. I'll deal with you later." There were no more chuckles. But what about guarding the camp, sir?" "Don't you question my orders again, Corporal. If I say the whole camp, I mean the whole bally camp. The guards as well. Now do as I say right now, or you will be peeling potatoes until demob. Yes, sir. Right away, sir." The line went dead. "Good. 20 minutes should do it," said Jack. 20 minutes later, with Joel now driving, they took the rusting old Vauxhall Viva a little further down the road and drove straight into the deserted army base. The place seemed eerie as they drove slowly past the deserted guardroom, along the gravel driveway, past the parade ground, and then past row after row of barrack rooms. These all had lights blazing away, the doors swinging in the breeze, but not a soul in sight. Jack pointed to a small brick building to the rear of the camp. "Park around the back, just to be sure." A few moments later, Jack pressed a series of entry codes on the electronic doors. These slid open. They were in. "Welcome to the Snip Laboratory, lads." The room was oblong in shape, but the first thing they noticed was there were no windows. Against every wall was a computer or a machine of some sort. In the middle of the room was a large aluminum table, upon which were reams and reams of papers, files, manuals, logbooks, and a football pools coupon next to a little square silver machine which bore the legend Permutation Calculator. Jack looked at it and smiled. If you've ever wondered why most pools winners are from around here, there's your answer. Ken and Joel just gave it a quick glance and walked on behind Jack. Ken held on to the nuclear trousers for grim life. As Ken and Joel looked around all four walls, amazed at the array of mind-boggling machinery, Jack took the trousers from Ken and placed them on a chair in the middle of the room. First of all, he made them bend at the knee, so the legs dangled down over the seat, while the waist rested against the lower back of the chair, which had various straps, clasps, and fasteners attached to the backrest. Jack fastened a metal clasp over each leg, and then looked up and then walked to the side of the room and wheeled over a metal stand on casters. This had 3 hinges along its length, and at the top was a large, hollow, silver-colored globe, but open underneath, a little like a space helmet. The hinges enabled the globe to be adjusted until positioned correctly over the chair, directly above its subject. This was the brain. Jack then lifted up from the back of the chair what the other 2 thought were straps for tying people down. Neither could help thinking it, but both men felt like they were in an execution chamber, looking at the infamous electric chair. The straps for securing the prisoners were, in reality, a pair of braces made from a pliable metal that neither Ken nor Joel had ever seen before. Jack then attached each end of the braces, which doubled as electronic connections, to both the trousers and the brain. "Stand back now. You'll see a green glow, and you'll hear a humming noise, but you should be safe," said Jack rather unconvincingly. Ken and Joel just looked at each other, more than slightly worried, and both dwelled on the word should. Jack turned on a little switch at the side of the chair. "Stand back now!" "You've already said that," retorted a nervous Ken. "Yeah, well, can't be too careful." Jack went over to his 2 friends, ushering them even further back. They watched as the headless trousers seemed to come to, as if it was a human that had been knocked out. They struggled momentarily to try and free themselves from the straps and braces, but then the effects of the machine began to kick in. As the trousers were again subdued, the whole room lit up, as each and every machine along each of the walls burst into life with an array of flashing lights of every color. They buzzed and whirred and zinged and dinged and sped through billions of calculations, visible only as a blur on the various screens. The sounds from around the room began to lessen, and the light show was no more. Then came a strange, computer-type voice coming from the biggest computer in the center of the wall to the rear of the room. This was the SNP mainframe. The trousers had also been electronically reanimated and moved ever so slightly in the chair as the SNP machine issued its verbal report, gleaned from the nuclear trousers. The 3 men stood, amazed, and listened. "Mission successful. Neutralized supplies of target area despite strong local resistance. Assume enemy agent bull stock. It's gone bonkers!" spluttered Ken. "That stupid housekeeper! She's gone and used BioClean!" spluttered Jack. Ken and Joel again looked at each other and smirked. "It's the chemicals they use in the washing powder. It affects the implant. Hang on a mo." Jack walked over to the SNP computer and pressed a switch. They all looked at the juddering trousers and waited. But could not move on to exit rendezvous. Jack tutted, and once again went over to the snip machine. This time the humming and the glow increased, and he ushered his friends even further back to just by the door, leaving Ken and Joel with the rather expedient thought of going through it in a way. But they didn't. Returned to base. Then silence. Ken and Joel both went to speak, but Jack gestured for them to remain silent, and strained his ears, as if there should be more from the snip machine, and of course the trousers. A few seconds later, "Await next mission." "That's it!" exclaimed Jack. "That's what I wanted to hear. That phrase now triggers the de-implanting process. Watch." The three men watched as the green light turned orange, and the low humming noise became a high-pitched whirring sound, a bit like a dentist drill. A minute later, nothing. The glow had gone, there was no sound, and the trousers had lost their synthetic personality and lay flat and limp in the chair. "Whew! Thank the Lord for that!" exclaimed Ken. "Now we can get back to normal." "About time and all," agreed a relieved Joel. "Yeah, too right," added Jack. "It's a good job we got these back before turning myself in. It must count for something." "About 10 years in the glass house, then slung out on your ear if I get my way," said General Lewis Agincourt Hicks, commander of the Nuclear Espionage Regiment. While the three friends had been congratulating themselves on their victory, the general and an entourage of well-pipped top brass and a plethora of white-coated, bespectacled, bearded boffins had rushed into the room, upon receiving an urgent call from Corporal Lennon, who had been set up once too often by Corporal Jack Anderson. Although he had indeed been part of a failed military invasion of Andover bus station, it was locked, nor were there any troublesome trousers, nuclear or otherwise, anywhere to be seen. Jack, despite being in civvies, and very dirty, ragged ones at that, stood to attention, gulped, and saluted. He then began his frantic pleas for mercy. But, sir, it wasn't my fault. It was, well... But then there were more interruptions. In through the door came Field Marshal Hilary Montague of the Whitehall General Staff, and his own retinue of lackeys. Ken and his friends noticed that the Field Marshal led General Hicks away from the strange gathering. He whispered in the General's ear and shook his head. Ken had an idea that whatever the General had cooked up for Jack would not now apply. But why? The General, now fuming inside, turned to Jack and gave him a sneering grin. "I said, if I get my way, which, luckily for you, does not now seem likely. Now, get yourself back to—" But General Hicks was now stopped in his tracks by the sound of screeching brakes, as a cavalcade of official-looking vehicles scrunched to a halt on the gravel outside, and yet more people piled into the already overcrowded laboratory. It was the Prime Minister and all of his official staff from number 10 Downing Street. But this still wasn't all. A less official-looking convoy, including a badly dented tractor, pulled up behind the London delegation. Out stepped, or climbed down, Farmer Packer, Alderman Ivan Jugg, the mayor's representative for Forbes Mallet, Jeremy Kelly, M.D., of Kleenex, and an angry-looking Mr. Hollings. The strange procession of the lesser and greater made their way up the short gravel path. The Prime Minister rushed ahead of his lackeys and strode into the room. "Which one of you gentlemen is Ken Rowley?" "I," I am, Mr. Prime Minister, sir, gulped a nervous Ken. Well done, well done. My, you have been through the mill, haven't you? Exclaimed the Prime Minister. I don't know how you knew how vital it was to recover those trousers, but that was a smart piece of work, very well done. And I believe you had help? Yes, indeed, Mr. Prime Minister, sir. My two friends helped me every step of the way. This is Joel Warrington. Joel, due to being terrified at being in such elevated company, curtsied, and a big clump of wet mud flew off Joel's jacket and landed on the Prime Minister's highly polished brogues. Seeing the variety of smirks around the room, the Prime Minister coughed. Ahem, yes, well done to you, my man, good job. And who is this young fellow? Oh, I'm Corporal Jack Anderson, sir, replied Jack, whom, in his current state, looked to the Prime Minister like a battle-hardened veteran. One of our finest, I see. Well, Corporal, you won't be a corporal much longer, young fellow, I'll see to that. Just you mark my words. Jack gulped. He'd blown it after all, but then he heard the Prime Minister whisper in the Field Marshal's ear, something along the lines of, "Sergeant, and quick about it." Jack smiled and breathed a huge sigh of relief. But there was still Farmer Packer to contend with. How they were going to explain the loss of 2 whole fields of ripe vegetables, they did not know. Farmer Packer moved closer to the 3 men, but then turned to the Prime Minister. "If I may, sir, I have something to say." "Yes, of course, you carry on, don't mind me." "Now, gentlemen, first of all, please accept my heartfelt apologies for trying to pepper your backside, for shooting at you. But I thought you were a gang of arsonists hired by the developers to drive me out. I now realize how wrong I was. Still, I don't know how you knew I was in danger of losing everything. But your getting rid of the diseased crops and the marsh lizards, all in one night, was a work of sheer genius. Every other farm for 20 miles has been ruined, but you've saved my cabbages and cauliflowers, and you've made the potato and turnip fields suitable for replanting immediately. I will never, ever be able to repay you for all that you have done." "Oh, well, no need at all," came Ken's expedient response, with the slightest of glances to his 2 friends. "Now then, Ken," it was a smiling Jeremy Kelly. "Some adventure you've had here, eh? It's a good job they knew it was our firm by the logo on your van. Anyway, I want to thank you personally, Ken. The MOD called around earlier on. Despite the wild goose chase, they have realized the future possibilities of such technology. But the thing is, they need a cleaning firm they can trust. Cleanicax! Us! I've just signed a £30 million contract, and it's all down to you and your friends. So, see me on Monday. The sooner you get settled in as Deputy Managing Director, the better. Well, see you on Monday, then." He shook hands with the stunned Ken Rowley and left, with a miserable-looking Mr. Hollings slinking behind him. Ken did not have time to ponder on such welcome news, as there was yet another interruption. "My trousers! I thought I'd never see them again. Damn Derby Walla!" exclaimed one Harris Kitchener St. John. Old man St. John was pushed in a wheelchair by his equally relieved son over to where the lifeless DJs were crumpled on the chair. After allowing his father to retrieve his prized possessions, St. John the Younger pushed his father around to face the packed room of astounded faces. While St. John the Elder sneered at Ken and continued to mutter colonial insults under his breath, the Younger was in a far more conciliatory mood, on the surface anyway. With thoughts in his mind of a Fleet Street or even a publisher's bidding war for the exclusive rights to the £1 million story, "My Father Wears Atomic Pants," he strode over to Ken, wearing a ridiculous grin on his face. "R.P. A little something for you. You deserve it." Graham Kitchener St. John put an envelope in Ken's hand. He was to find out later that inside was a check for £5,000, which he promised to share with Jack and Joel. The day after, he received another note from St. John the Younger. It was a bill for £5,020 to pay for the extensive repairs to the family's 1930s classic Morgan convertible. At this point, Joel began to feel a little left out, but not for long. "Monday morning, my old round?" suggested Ken, who knew Joel was worried about the possibility of there being redundancies within his own firm. Joel perked up immediately. "Great! Thanks, sir, boss!" "Oh, Flupsy-Wupsy! Look at the state of you!" came a shout. A tearful but elated Mrs. Rita Rowley was stood in the doorway, flanked by both Maxine Yeo and Mrs. Ellie Kelly, Jeremy's wife. They were both beaming, as they both thought the world of the Rowley family, and were delighted at their latent good fortune. Although Rita was more concerned with her husband's antics over the last few days, and the fact that he seemed to be covered in more than just mud from his escapades around rural Wiltshire, Rita, whose rheumatics had been very bad lately, was helped across the room, where she received a big hug from Ken. Well, half a big hug, as Ken deliberately kept his wife at arm's length. "I'm sorry, love. It was all too complicated to explain properly," apologized Ken. "It doesn't matter, Ken. I'm just glad that you're safe." "Oh, roly-poly! I won't be able to call you that any more, will I? You will be disappointed, won't you?" "Well, maybe after work, eh?" suggested the thoughtful Maxine. Yeah, that'll be fine, Maxie, just fine," replied Ken. "Well done, Ken. Jerry and I have longed for the day you and Rita had a bit of luck," said Ellie Kelly. "Thanks, Elle. You're good pals, both of you." "Come on then, Reet. I'll give you a lift home. Coming, Maxie?" asked Ellie Kelly. Rita Rowley hugged her husband again, this time a proper hug. She didn't care. She was just glad that her big, fat, cuddly Flupsy-Wupsy was safe and well. "Bye, love, won't be long," said Ken. The three ladies left for home. "Right, then," exclaimed the Prime Minister. "Strange coincidence, that. My coming here, anyway, for a totally different reason. Shall we? Oh, Flupsy-Wupsy, before I go, goodbye, and thanks again to all of you." Jack and Joel were now smirking and wondering whether Ken had any more nicknames. The entire entourage of politicians, top brass, and assorted members of the community walked past an astounded Ken, Jack, and Joel. Only the Boffins remained from this strange entourage, and commenced checking their prized den for any irregularities. Alderman Jug, a small, scrawny, elderly man, whose chain seemed to weigh him down, making him stoop, reached the door, but then stopped and turned to Ken and his two friends. "Aren't you coming to the festival? Both the PM and his lordship are attending, and you'll be the guest of honor." "What festival?" asked a mystified Ken. "What festival, he says. The festival of St. Leo of the Potatoes, of course." This concludes our presentation of The Old Man's Trousers by Josh Rogan, narrated by Jan Elaine Gray. This has been a Jammer Audio production.